How dare you sneak in here? Mom slapped me at Dad's black tie birthday. Dad whispered, "Leave," through the kitchen. Then the governor stood up and said, "Do you know who she is? My name is Jocelyn, and at 34 years old, I attended my father's exclusive 60th birthday gala, an event I supposedly was not wealthy or refined enough to be invited to. If you have ever had a toxic family mistake, your silence for weakness, hit that like and subscribe button. Because what my mother didn't know when she struck me across the face was that I didn't crash the party. I owned the building, I funded the charity, and the governor she was desperately trying to impress worked for me. The sharp burning sting of my mother Patricia's hand across my left cheek radiated all the way down to my jawline. The force of her sudden attack caused the crystal champagne flute I had been holding to slip from my fingers. It shattered loudly against the imported Italian marble floor of the grand VIP alcove, sending a splash of golden liquid across the hem of my dress. Patricia did not care about the broken glass, nor did she care about the scene she was creating in the secluded viewing room. She stepped closer, her perfectly manicured hands trembling with a familiar toxic rage. Her eyes blazed with the same contempt she had directed at me since childhood. "You have some nerve showing up here, Jocelyn?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. "Look at you, wearing some cheap off-the-rack clearance rag to your father's diamond jubilee. Are you trying to humiliate us in front of the state elite? Did you sneak in here to beg for a handout because your pathetic little desk job cannot cover your rent?" Before I could even lower my hand from my burning cheek, my father Donovan grabbed my upper arm. His grip was entirely too tight, his fingers digging into my skin like heavy iron vices. Donovan was a prominent real estate tycoon who had built his vast empire on shady government contracts, under-the-table bribes, and ruthless evictions. Tonight, however, he was playing the role of a distinguished, benevolent philanthropist for the cameras. He leaned in close, his breath smelling heavily of expensive scotch and aged cigars. "Leave through the kitchen right now, Jocelyn," he growled under his breath, frantically glancing over his shoulder toward the main ballroom doors to ensure no one was watching. "You are ruining my 60th birthday. Do not make a scene and destroy our family image tonight of all nights. Xavier is about to close a massive $50 million state contract with Governor Montgomery. If the governor comes up here and sees my estranged, low-level paper pusher of a daughter loitering in the VIP section, the optics will be absolutely disastrous for our brand." A sharp, mocking laugh echoed from the doorway of the alcove before I could respond. I turned to see my older sister Brittany striding into the room, clinging tightly to the arm of her husband Xavier. Brittany had always been the golden child, the entitled daughter who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. Xavier, a tall, imposing African-American man who loved to parade his supposed wealth, styled himself as a visionary tech entrepreneur. But everyone in our family knew his primary skill was aggressively spending my father's money to fund his fake luxury lifestyle. Xavier took a slow, arrogant sip of his whiskey, shaking his head as he looked me up and down with pure disgust. Still wearing the same pathetic clearance rack suits, Jocelyn Xavier chuckled deliberately, adjusting his shirt cuff to flash a massive diamond-encrusted watch under the chandelier lighting. "It is honestly embarrassing to look at you. Do you even make enough at that entry-level desk job to afford the valet parking fee for this venue?" Brittany smirked, leaning her head against Xavier's shoulder in a display of manufactured perfection. "Give her a break, babe. It is hard to afford nice things when you are a complete failure in life." She looked at me with a gaze so condescending it could freeze water. "You should have stayed in your tiny, depressing apartment, Jocelyn. You do not belong in rooms with people of our caliber." Xavier stepped closer, his arrogance suffocating the small space as he decided to twist the knife further. "Remember when your dad had to abruptly cut off your master's degree tuition just to bail you out of your pathetic student debt?" Xavier let out a booming theatrical laugh that echoed off the marble walls. "Oh wait, I forgot the best part. He did not cut your tuition because of your debt. He cut your tuition to buy me this exact Rolex for my birthday, and to provide the seed money for my first software company. That is what a real financial investment looks like. You throw money at proven winners, not a bitter spinster who pushes paper for a living. I stood there in the center of their coordinated hostility, surrounded by the four people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small and insignificant. They expected me to cry. They expected me to lower my head in absolute shame, apologize for my existence, and scurry out the back service door just like they had conditioned me to do when I was younger. They fully expected to break the helpless, broke Jocelyn they had financially cut off 5 years ago. But I did not shed a single tear. I did not break eye contact. Instead, I calmly reached into my designer clutch, pulled out a pristine silk handkerchief, and gently dabbed at the few drops of champagne that had splashed onto my dress. Patricia rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly at my composure. Do not bother trying to save that cheap polyester rag, Jocelyn. Just throw it in the dumpster on your way out the service exit. I looked at my mother, maintaining an absolute, unwavering gaze. I am not leaving, Patricia, I said, my voice steady, cold, and entirely devoid of the fear she thrived on. And for the strict record, this cheap polyester rag is an exclusive custom couture gown, straight from a private atelier in Milan. It cost exactly $15,000, which is approximately 3 times the limit on the credit card Dad just maxed out to pay for the ice sculptures in the main lobby. Donovan's face turned a dangerous, volatile shade of crimson. He let go of my arm as if he had been physically burned, sputtering in total disbelief. How dare you speak to your mother that way? He shouted, his polished mask of the benevolent patriarch slipping completely to reveal the angry tyrant beneath. You are delusional. You do not have $15,000 to your name. You are a low-level administrative assistant who can barely afford groceries. I simply smiled, allowing a predatory expression to cross my face that made Xavier shift uncomfortably on his expensive leather shoes. You really have absolutely no idea what I do for a living, do you? I asked, letting my gaze sweep over the four of them, analyzing their pathetic desperation. You spent the last 5 years so obsessed with funding Xavier's imaginary tech empire and maintaining your fake high society image that you never bothered to check who was actually pulling the political strings in this state. Patricia stepped forward, raising her hand again as if she was preparing to deliver a second vicious slap to my face. I will call the venue security right now and have you physically thrown onto the street like the absolute trash you are, she threatened, her voice shaking with unchecked rage. You will not ruin this night for us. The governor is walking into this room any minute, and we will not let a worthless failure embarrass our family in front of the most powerful man in the state. I did not flinch as Patricia raised her hand. I just stood my ground, waiting for the exact moment I knew was coming. Go ahead, Mother, I challenged her softly, my voice echoing in the tense silence of the VIP room. Call security. Let us see who they actually work for tonight. Suddenly, a sharp, deafening screech of microphone feedback sliced through the ambient noise of the gala. The smooth jazz music playing from the main ballroom halted instantly. The low hum of hundreds of wealthy donors, politicians, and socialites died away into an abrupt, heavy silence. Every single head in the venue turned toward the main stage. Governor Richard Montgomery stood at the grand podium. He was a towering, silver-haired figure of absolute authority, the most powerful man in the state. He did not look at the crowd of billionaires eagerly waiting for his attention. His piercing gaze was locked directly on the elevated VIP alcove where we stood. He tapped the microphone twice. The heavy thuds echoed through the massive hall like gunshots. Cut the house audio, the governor ordered sharply. He stepped away from the podium and began descending the grand, sweeping marble staircase. A specialized security detail flanked him, parting the sea of elite guests like Moses parting the Red Sea. The heavy, rhythmic sound of his polished shoes against the marble steps amplified the suffocating tension in the room. Donovan immediately abandoned his aggressive posture. His entire demeanor transformed from a threatening tyrant into a submissive, eager servant. He rapidly smoothed the lapels of his tuxedo, a frantic, desperate smile stretching across his face. He is coming over here, Donovan whispered urgently to Xavier. Get ready. This is it. This is where we seal the contract. Xavier straightened his posture, puffing out his chest even further, flashing his brilliant, practiced smile. He stepped forward, eagerly extending his hand as Governor Montgomery approached the velvet ropes of the VIP section. "Governor, it is an absolute honor," Xavier began, his voice dripping with sycophantic charm. The governor did not even look at Xavier. He walked right past the extended hand, treating the arrogant tech entrepreneur like an invisible piece of furniture. He walked past a hyperventilating Donovan. He walked past a stunned Brittany. Governor Montgomery stopped directly next to me. He turned his imposing frame to face my mother, whose hand was still awkwardly raised in the air from signaling the security guards. "Madam," the governor said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a chilling absolute authority that required no microphone. "Do you have any earthly idea who you just raised your hand to?" Patricia froze. The fake aristocratic smile she had perfected over decades of climbing the social ladder began to violently tremble. Her manicured hands dropped to her sides. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting frantically between me and the most powerful politician in the region. "Governor Montgomery, I am so incredibly sorry for this unseemly disruption," Patricia stammered, her voice pitching up in pure panic. She immediately attempted to salvage the situation, using her favorite tactic of gaslighting and public humiliation. "This woman is merely Jocelyn, our estranged and deeply troubled daughter. She has struggled with severe mental health issues ever since she failed out of her graduate program. She frequently sneaks into high-profile family events to cause drama because she is terribly jealous of her sister Brittany. Please do not pay her any mind." Security was just about to escort her to a clinic. The governor did not laugh. He did not smile. He stared at Patricia with a look of such profound, unadulterated disgust that my mother actually took a physical step backward. "Troubled." The governor repeated the word, dripping with icy disdain. "Estranged." He slowly shook his head, looking at Donovan, then Xavier, and finally resting his fierce gaze back on Patricia. "This gala, this entire building, and my entire re-election campaign would not exist without the woman standing right in front of you," the governor declared, his voice echoing loudly enough for the entire front row of the ballroom to hear. "Jocelyn is the chief political strategist for my administration. She dictates state policy. She manages crises you cannot even fathom. She is the sole reason I am standing here tonight, and she is the only reason your husband's corrupt little real estate firm was even allowed to bid on state land." A collective audible gasp rippled through the crowd below. The wealthy elite of the city began whispering furiously, their eyes wide with shock. Patricia's jaw dropped open, completely unhinged. The color drained entirely from Donovan's face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. Thick beads of cold sweat visibly formed on his forehead. He stumbled backward, bumping heavily into a cocktail table. Brittany clutched Xavier's arm, her perfectly contoured face twisted in sheer terror as she stared at me, finally realizing that the sister she had mocked for years held the keys to their entire existence. Xavier stood frozen, his eyes darting frantically. He realized in a fraction of a second that his entire fake empire, his pending state contracts, and his stolen wealth were disintegrating in real time. The panic in his eyes quickly morphed into desperate, reckless arrogance. He needed to save his skin. He needed to control the narrative before he lost everything. Xavier stepped aggressively forward, shoving past Donovan. He plastered on a fake confident smile, projecting his deep voice loudly for the entire VIP section and the watching crowd to hear. "Governor, with all due respect, you have been severely scammed," Xavier announced, pointing a steady accusing finger directly at my face. "Jocelyn is a total fraud." Xavier did not wait for the governor to process his aggressive accusation. He immediately spun around and signaled aggressively to the audiovisual team stationed in the glass booth overlooking the grand ballroom. Xavier had always been a master of flashy presentations and empty promises, a skill he used to drain my father's bank accounts for years. Suddenly, the massive digital screens that had been displaying a tacky golden montage of Donovan's real estate achievements flickered and went dark. A second later, they illuminated with the slick, glowing logo of Xavier's supposedly revolutionary software company. Xavier grabbed a wireless microphone from a passing event coordinator, striding right up to the velvet rope of the VIP section so his booming voice would carry to every wealthy donor and politician in the room. He pointed the microphone at his mouth, projecting his fake, charismatic businessman persona. "Governor Montgomery, please allow me to apologize for this woman's disturbing behavior," Xavier announced, his voice dripping with manufactured sincerity. "Jocelyn is a rogue, low-level clerk who somehow managed to hack into the guest list tonight. She is attempting to hijack the most important moment of our family's philanthropic history. If you look at the screens behind me, you will see the truth." The giant displays shifted to reveal an image of a massive ceremonial check made out for $10 million. The check was made payable to the governor's Urban Renewal Initiative and printed in massive bold letters across the bottom were the names of Brittany and Xavier. "My wife and I have worked tirelessly for the past 8 months to secure this $10 million donation for your administration," Xavier continued, wrapping a protective, loving arm around Brittany's waist. Brittany immediately put on a pristine, modest smile, waving gracefully to the applauding crowd below. "Jocelyn has been deeply obsessed with my wife's success since we were in college." Xavier lied smoothly, his eyes narrowing at me with genuine malice. "She is a pathological liar who is trying to steal our credit because she has accomplished absolutely nothing with her own life." Seeing a desperate lifeline to save his precious public image, Donovan eagerly jumped into the performance. He snatched the microphone from Xavier's hand and stepped forward, putting on a masterful, award-winning performance of a grieving, heartbroken father. He even managed to force a genuine-looking tear to pool in the corner of his eye. "Governor Montgomery, I am so deeply ashamed that you had to witness this," Donovan said, his voice cracking with perfectly calculated, manufactured emotion. "My daughter Jocelyn has suffered from severe, dangerous delusions for years. When she failed out of her graduate program and we had to firmly stop funding her reckless lifestyle, her jealousy toward Brittany became a toxic obsession. Brittany and Xavier worked day and night to raise that $10 million for your campaign. Jocelyn is just trying to hijack their hard work to make herself feel important. Please do not let her severe mental illness ruin this magnificent charity event." Patricia quickly flanked her husband, nodding vigorously and dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk tissue. "It breaks a mother's heart to admit it to the world," Patricia added, her voice shaking with fake sorrow. "But she is completely untethered from reality. We have tried to get her professional help for her lies, but she refuses." The crowd of billionaires, socialites, and local politicians began murmuring loudly, casting pitying glances toward my parents and judging disgusted looks at me. Governor Montgomery stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, his piercing gaze shifting from the giant digital screens to my face. I remained absolutely motionless. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not act like the hysterical, jealous woman they were so desperately trying to paint me as. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip from a crystal glass of ice water a server had left on a nearby table. I let the silence stretch, letting their arrogant lies hang heavily in the air, giving them enough rope to hang themselves completely. Then I raised my right hand into the air and snapped my fingers exactly once. The sharp, crisp sound cut through the ambient whispers of the ballroom like a cracking whip. From the shadowed, secluded corner of the VIP alcove, a man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped forward into the bright chandelier light. It was the chief executive officer of the state bank, a man who managed the finances of every major political entity in the region. He had been quietly observing the entire pathetic spectacle from the moment Patricia had slapped me. The bank CEO casually reached out and took the microphone directly from a stunned, wide-eyed Donovan. "I am afraid you are the one suffering from severe delusions," Donovan, the CEO, announced, his voice echoing with absolute, undeniable authority. He raised his own phone and tapped the screen. Up in the audio-visual booth, my personal security team, who had already taken control of the systems, mirrored his phone directly to the giant screens in the ballroom. The image of Xavier's fake ceremonial check vanished instantly. It was replaced by a raw, indisputable banking wire transfer receipt bearing the official seal of the state bank. This $10 million political action fund did not originate from Xavier's software company. The CEO explained, his voice booming through the silent hall. As you can see by the routing numbers and account names currently displayed for every single person in this room to read, those funds were wired directly from a private holding firm. A holding firm entirely owned and operated exclusively by Jocelyn. The entire ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps, shocked whispers, and the sound of reporters furiously typing on their phones. Brittany's smug, graceful smile completely dissolved, replaced by a mask of sheer panic. She dropped Xavier's arm as if he were suddenly contagious. I took a slow step forward, ensuring my voice was loud, clear, and dripping with icy condescension. Did you really think you could forge a digital receipt on a $10 million wire transfer, and I would not notice, Xavier? I asked, watching the sweat pour down his face. You took a screenshot of my foundation's deposit, slapped your ridiculous fake company logo over it in a basic editing software, and tried to hand it to the governor of this state as your own hard work. That is not just pathetic, Xavier. That is a federal financial crime. Xavier started backing away, his mouth opening and closing as he searched frantically for a lie that could save him. But there was nowhere to hide. The evidence was plastered on 20-foot screens for the entire city elite to see. The humiliation was absolute. Donovan, realizing his golden son-in-law had just exposed their entire family as fraudulent thieves in front of the governor, went into a state of blind, desperate rage. He spun around toward the massive security detail guarding the venue doors. "Throw them out!" Donovan screamed at the top of his lungs, his face purple with fury. "Throw Jocelyn and this liar out right now. I rented this venue, and I demand they be removed by force." The collective gasp from the ballroom below sounded like a sudden rush of wind. The undeniable proof of Xavier forging a $10 million wire transfer receipt hung brilliantly on the massive digital screens for every single politician, billionaire, and socialite to read. The absolute silence that followed was suffocating. Hundreds of eyes shifted from the glowing bank records directly to the elevated VIP alcove, staring at my family with unadulterated disgust. Donovan was sweating profusely, thick beads of moisture rolling down his forehead and soaking into the collar of his expensive tuxedo. The realization that his golden son-in-law was a monumental fraud, and that this fraud had just been exposed in front of the most powerful political figures in the state, pushed my father into a state of blind, frantic panic. Instead of showing any remorse or humility, Donovan doubled down on his arrogance. He desperately tried to reclaim control of a situation that had already entirely slipped through his fingers. "This is a fabricated smear campaign," Donovan shouted, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger at the bank's CEO and then at me. "She hired hackers to manipulate the screens. She is a jealous, unstable woman, trying to ruin our philanthropic efforts." Donovan spun around, locking his wild eyes on the venue's private security detail standing near the velvet ropes. The head of security was a massive, broad-shouldered man in a tailored black suit with a communication earpiece securely fastened. "Grab them," Donovan commanded, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "Grab my delusional daughter and this fake bank executive and physically drag them out of this building. Throw them onto the street right now. I demand it." The head of security did not move a single muscle. He stood firmly in place, his hands clasped neatly in front of him, his expression completely blank. "Did you not hear me?" Donovan roared, taking an aggressive step toward the massive guard. "I am Donovan, the host of this magnificent gala. I paid tens of thousands of dollars to rent this grand hall tonight. I am a prominent real estate developer in this city, and I could buy and sell your entire career by tomorrow morning. If you do not forcibly remove these trespassers immediately, I will ensure you never work in private security again." The head of security slowly crossed his arms over his chest. He looked past Donovan's sweating, furious face and met my eyes. I gave the guard a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. "I am afraid I cannot follow that order, sir," the head of security stated, his voice a low, immovable rumble that carried clearly across the quiet VIP section. "I only take removal orders directly from the property owner." Donovan threw his hands into the air, a harsh, mocking laugh bursting from his throat. "I am the property owner for tonight," he yelled, practically spitting the words. "I rented this entire estate. My name is on the hospitality contract." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my heels clicking softly but firmly against the imported marble floor. You paid a $50,000 deposit to rent a room for exactly 6 hours. Donovan, I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, yet laced with absolute authority. You do not own this space. You simply bought a temporary, overpriced ticket to pretend you belong among the actual elite. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a heavy matte black metal card, along with a neatly folded legal document bearing the official notarized seal of the State Commercial Registry. I held them up, ensuring the bright light of the crystal chandelier caught the embossed gold lettering for everyone to see. You rented a room for a single night. I continued, savoring the absolute terror that began to rapidly expand in his eyes. But I bought the entire hospitality group that owns this estate 3 months ago. When your commercial properties started facing foreclosure last year and you secretly sold off your hospitality shares to stay afloat, you thought a nameless corporate conglomerate bought them. That conglomerate was my private holding firm. Donovan stumbled backward, as if I had physically struck him in the chest. His mouth fell open, but no words came out. Brittany shrank back against the wall, her arrogant posture completely collapsing. Xavier looked frantically toward the exit, shifting his weight like a trapped animal desperately looking for an escape route. I own the marble floor you are currently standing on, I declared, delivering the final crushing blow. I own the prestigious catering company that served your dinner. I sign the paychecks for the security guards you are currently attempting to order around. You are not the host of this gala anymore, Donovan. You are actively trespassing on my private commercial property, and I am formally revoking your invitation. The crowd in the ballroom below erupted into furious whispers. Camera flashes burst from the lower floor as wealthy donors and local reporters began documenting the spectacular, very public destruction of my father's reputation. The social elite literally turned their backs, refusing to even look at Donovan and Xavier anymore. The social and financial annihilation was absolute. Patricia could not handle the public shame. For a narcissist obsessed with image and high society, standing this level of exposure was her ultimate, most terrifying nightmare. The pristine, aristocratic mask she had worn for decades shattered entirely. She snapped. Her perfectly coiffed hair fell into her face as she lunged forward with manic, unhinged strength. She grabbed my upper arm, her nails digging sharply into my skin. "Get inside right now!" Patricia shrieked, her voice stripped of all its former grace, sounding wild and desperate. She yanked me forcefully away from the balcony edge, dragging me roughly toward the heavy oak doors of the private soundproof VIP lounge located at the back of the alcove. She was terrified of the cameras, terrified of the whispers, and absolutely terrified of the punishing, judgmental glare of Governor Montgomery, who was watching her every move. Donovan immediately followed, pushing aggressively past the security guards, who simply looked at me for permission to intervene. I raised my hand slightly silently, signaling my security team to stand down, allowing my parents to retreat into the isolated room. I wanted to see exactly how far their desperation would push them. Brittany and Xavier scrambled after us, running away from the blinding flashes of cell phone cameras and the ruin of their fake empire. Patricia slammed the heavy oak door shut behind us, twisting the solid brass lock with a loud, definitive click. We were completely cut off from the main gala, enclosed in the lavish, heavily soundproofed private suite. There were no cameras here, no politicians, and no wealthy donors to perform for. Patricia turned to face me, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with a terrifying mixture of cornered panic and pure malice. She reached into her beaded handbag with trembling fingers. "You think you have won because you bought a building, Jocelyn," Patricia snarled, pulling out a thick manila folder and slamming it violently onto the mahogany table between us. "You think you are so smart and so powerful now? You have won absolutely nothing. We have the will." The heavy thud of the manila folder against the polished mahogany table echoed through the soundproofed VIP lounge like a gavel striking a judge's block. Patricia stood over the table, her chest heaving, as she desperately tried to regain her manufactured aristocratic composure. The terrifying reality of losing her social standing had temporarily broken her mind, but this folder seemed to anchor her back to her familiar cruelty. Donovan wiped a thick layer of cold sweat from his forehead using the sleeve of his expensive tuxedo. He stared at the yellow envelope, and I watched in real time as his crippling panic was instantly replaced by a sickening, triumphant sneer. He puffed out his chest, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with my mother. "You can buy all the real estate in this city. Jocelyn," Donovan threatened, his voice dropping into a harsh, gravelly growl. "You can hire all the security guards you want and flash your little metal bank cards in the lobby. But none of that matters when we have the ultimate legal leverage to destroy you." Brittany strutted forward, completely abandoning the terrified victim routine she had displayed out in the ballroom. She crossed her arms, a vicious, predatory smile spreading across her perfectly contoured face. She looked at the folder, then looked at me, her eyes practically shining with malicious glee. "Did you really think you were the only one making quiet financial moves over the last few years?" Brittany asked, her voice dripping with sheer arrogance. "Go ahead, Jocelyn. Open the folder. Read what is inside. Read exactly how worthless you actually are to this family." I did not move toward the table. I kept my hands resting lightly at my sides, watching them perform their pathetic little victory dance. When I did not reach for the documents, Xavier decided to step in, desperately needing to feel powerful again after being exposed as a fraud on the giant digital screens outside. Xavier aggressively snatched the folder from the table, ripped it open, and slammed the thick stack of legal papers down right in front of me. "This is your beloved grandmother's final will and testament," Xavier announced, tapping the paper hard with his index finger. "The grandmother who supposedly loved you so much. The woman you sat by in the hospital while the rest of us were busy living our lives. Well read the final page, Jocelyn. It explicitly states that you get absolutely nothing. $0, not a single penny from her massive estate. It clearly dictates that Brittany inherits the entire family trust, every piece of property, and all the liquid assets." Brittany stepped right up to my face, her expensive perfume clashing with the bitter scent of her jealousy. She leaned in close, ensuring every word she spoke was designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. "Do you remember the week Grandma died?" Brittany asked, her tone mocking and cruel. "Do you remember sitting in your pathetic tiny studio apartment crying your eyes out because you could not even afford to hire a basic probate lawyer to look into her estate? You were taking out loans just to buy groceries, begging Dad for a small advance on your tuition. And we just shut the door in your face." I kept my expression perfectly blank as she continued her vicious tirade. "We legally and completely erased you from the bloodline that day." Brittany gloated, her voice rising with unhinged excitement. "You were too broke and too weak to fight back. We took everything she left behind. And do you want to know the best part, Jocelyn? Do you want to know exactly where your half of the inheritance went? That massive trust fund paid for Xavier's new software company. We took your future, your security, and your beloved grandmother's life savings, and we used it to buy Xavier his sports cars, our luxury vacations, and the seed money to get his business off the ground. You funded our entire luxury lifestyle, and you were too stupid to even realize it." Patricia nodded vigorously, crossing her arms in agreement. "You brought this on yourself, Jocelyn," she added coldly. "You chose to be a difficult, rebellious daughter. We simply secured the family assets for the children who actually deserved them. If you dare to call the police on Xavier for that charity check out there, we will take this will to the state Supreme Court. We will drain every single dollar of your new little political consulting firm in endless legal battles. We will tie you up in litigation for the next 20 years until you are bankrupt and living on the streets." The four of them stood in a unified front, staring at me with breathless anticipation. They were waiting for the breakdown. They were waiting for me to scream, to cry, to beg for a compromise, or to shatter under the weight of their ultimate betrayal. Instead, I simply threw my head back and let out a loud, genuine laugh. The sound of my laughter bounced off the soundproof walls of the VIP lounge. It was not a nervous laugh or a hysterical chuckle. It was a deep, relaxed laugh of pure amusement. The unified front immediately faltered. Donovan's arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by a deep, unsettling confusion. Patricia took a hesitant step backward, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for a trap. "What on earth is so funny to you, Xavier?" demanded his voice, cracking slightly under the pressure. "You just lost millions of dollars. You have absolutely no legal standing in this family." I slowly stopped laughing, wiping a mock tear of amusement from the corner of my eye. I took a deliberate step toward the mahogany table, looking down at the stack of papers Xavier had so aggressively slammed down. "I am not mad about the will, Xavier," I said, my voice dropping into a calm, icy tone that sent a visible shiver down Brittany's spine. "I am not mad because I do not need to read a single page of that document. I know exactly what it says. I know every single clause, every signature, and every fake notary stamp on those pages. I know all of this because I know for an absolute undeniable fact that this entire document is a complete and total forgery." Donovan's face went completely rigid. "Nonsense," he sputtered, his voice lacking any real conviction. "It was filed with the county clerk. It is a binding legal document." I slowly raised my left wrist, pulling back the long, elegant silk sleeve of my couture gown. I extended my arm directly into the center of their group. Fastened securely around my wrist was a sleek, high-tech smartwatch. The screen was completely black except for a small, bright red light that was blinking in a slow, steady, rhythmic pulse. "You see, Brittany?" I continued, keeping my wrist suspended in the air. "When I gained access to the highest levels of state government security, I also gained access to the best forensic financial investigators in the country. I spent the last 5 years quietly tearing our family's financial history apart piece by piece. I already found the real will hidden in an offshore safety deposit box under Dad's fake shell corporation. I already proved you forged Grandmother's signature while she was heavily medicated in hospice care." The color drained completely from Brittany's face. She stared at the blinking red light on my watch, her mouth opening in silent terror as the realization of what she had just done finally hit her. "And this blinking red light?" I asked, tapping the screen of the watch with my right index finger. "This means my device is actively streaming high-definition audio directly to a secure cloud server. A server that is currently being monitored in real time by my entire legal team and the State Fraud Division." I smiled, looking directly into my sister's horrified, trembling eyes. "Thank you for clearly and explicitly confessing to federal estate fraud, Brittany. Thank you for admitting on a secure federal recording that you stole millions of dollars to fund Xavier's fraudulent business." Patricia let out a strangled, breathless gasp, pressing both of her hands over her mouth in sheer horror. Xavier stumbled backward, his back hitting the wall with a loud thud as his legs nearly gave out beneath him. Donovan stared at the blinking red light on my wrist, the absolute certainty of his impending incarceration flashing before his eyes. "You recorded us," Donovan whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling. "You set us up in a locked room just to record us." "I did not set you up, Donovan," I replied coldly, lowering my arm and straightening my posture. "You dragged me into this room to threaten me. I just let you dig your own graves. And the best part is we are not even close to being finished." The absolute silence in the soundproof VIP lounge was suddenly shattered by a loud, obnoxious, booming laugh. While Donovan remained frozen in his chair, completely paralyzed by the horrifying realization that I owned every single piece of his massive real estate debt, Xavier simply threw his head back and laughed. The sound was incredibly grating, filled with a delusional arrogance that only a man completely detached from reality could muster. Xavier adjusted the lapels of his custom-tailored velvet jacket and took a slow, confident step forward. He moved with the swagger of a man who believed he was entirely untouchable. He reached out and wrapped a strong, protective arm around Brittany, pulling her tightly against his side. He planted a kiss on the side of her head, presenting them as a united, invincible power couple, standing against my supposedly pathetic threats. "You really thought you had us cornered, didn't you, Jocelyn?" Xavier chuckled, shaking his head, as he looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "You spent 5 entire years hiding in the shadows, scrounging together enough pennies to buy up a few defaulted commercial loans just to get back at your father. That is incredibly sad. It really is. You thought you were making this massive boss-level move by holding the mortgage to this family's properties. Xavier looked down at Donovan, who was still gasping for air, clutching his chest as his entire identity as a wealthy patriarch crumbled into dust. Xavier let out a disappointed sigh, clearly enjoying the fact that he was now stepping up as the ultimate savior of the family. "Get up!" Donovan Xavier ordered, his voice dripping with condescension as he addressed his father-in-law. "Stop hyperventilating over a few bad loans. You are acting like we are actually in trouble. You are acting like we do not have liquid capital ready to deploy at a moment's notice." Patricia immediately perked up. The sheer terror that had been gripping her features was instantly replaced by a frantic, desperate hope. She grabbed onto Xavier's arms, staring at her son-in-law, as if he were a divine entity, sent to rescue her from poverty and public humiliation. "Xavier, what are you saying?" Patricia begged, her voice trembling. "Can you fix this? Can you stop her from taking my house?" Xavier flashed a brilliant, blindingly white smile. He turned his attention entirely to me, puffing out his chest to project absolute dominance. "You cannot touch us," Jocelyn Xavier declared, his voice echoing powerfully through the lavish suite. "You can take your little binder of defaulted loans and throw it in the nearest trash can. Because earlier this afternoon, while you were busy trying to figure out how to crash this party, I officially signed a $50 million exclusive tech contract with the state government." Brittany let out a loud, triumphant gasp. She threw her arms around Xavier's neck, her previous terror completely vanishing. She looked at me with that familiar, sickeningly sweet smirk that had tormented me since childhood. $50 million, Brittany repeated, making sure to enunciate every single syllable. "You hear that, Jocelyn? My husband just secured $50 million in state funding. Your little debt collection stunt means absolutely nothing to us." Xavier gently patted Brittany's hand, basking in her adoration, and the sudden, overwhelming relief radiating from my parents. My software company was chosen by the highest levels of the state procurement office to completely overhaul their entire digital security grid, Xavier boasted, pacing back and forth across the imported rug. "It is a massive multi-year infrastructure project. The initial advance alone is more than enough to cover every single one of Donovan's pathetic mortgages. We can pay off your little debt by tomorrow morning, Jocelyn. I will write the check myself. I will wire the funds directly to your cheap little holding company before the banks even open." He stopped pacing and stood directly in front of me, his physical presence designed to be intimidating. But I did not shrink back. I just looked at him, maintaining perfect eye contact, letting him dig his own grave deeper and deeper with every arrogant word that spilled from his mouth. "This is exactly why you will always be a loser, Jocelyn." Xavier mocked, his tone turning vicious and deeply personal. "You lack vision. You lack charisma. You sneak around trying to ruin people because you do not have the talent to build anything of your own. You play with petty cash while black men like me build empires and generational wealth." He gestured expansively around the room, claiming ownership of the space, the moment, and the future. I did not sit around waiting for handouts. He continued, his ego inflating to dangerous proportions. I went out there and I played the game. I shook hands with state senators. I golfed with the procurement directors. I convinced the entire state apparatus that my software was the only thing standing between them and a total security collapse. I outsmarted all of them. I have the state in my pocket, Jocelyn. I control the infrastructure now. You are just a bitter, lonely woman who thought she could take down a titan. Patricia actually clapped her hands together, a short, delighted sound escaping her lips. "Oh, Xavier, you are an absolute godsend," she cried, tears of sheer relief pooling in her eyes. "I knew we were right to invest in your company. I knew you would protect this family from her vindictive jealousy." Donovan slowly stood up from his chair, his color returning. He straightened his tie, looking at me with renewed contempt. "You heard him, Jocelyn. We will buy back the debt tomorrow. Your little blackmail attempt is officially over. Now get out of my sight before I have my son-in-law call his new friends in the state government to audit your pathetic excuse for a consulting firm." I listened to their premature celebration, I listened to Xavier brag about bribing and manipulating the state government. I listened to the absolute certainty in his voice as he claimed he had the state in his pocket. It was the most beautiful, satisfying display of unearned hubris I had ever witnessed in my entire life. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Xavier. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression entirely calm. I let a slow, predatory smile spread across my face, revealing my teeth just enough to let him know he had walked directly into a trap. You really think the state handed you a $50 million contract without running it through the chief political strategist? Xavier stood frozen in the center of the lavish room. The boastful, arrogant smirk that had been plastered across his face just a second ago completely vanished, replaced by a sudden, hollow confusion. He blinked rapidly, looking around the room, as if waiting for someone to step out and explain a joke he did not understand. He looked at Donovan, then at Brittany, but they were both staring at me with a growing, suffocating dread. The absolute certainty he had possessed just moments prior was actively dissolving in the heavy, soundproofed air of the VIP lounge. "What are you talking about?" Xavier asked, his deep voice suddenly lacking all of its previous thunder. His hands, which had been gesturing so expansively to claim the space, slowly dropped to his sides. I went through the standard state procurement office. I dealt with the regional directors. You dealt with the puppets I put in place to handle low-level bureaucratic paperwork. I corrected him, keeping my tone terrifyingly calm. I reached into the sleek leather bag I had brought with me and pulled out a heavy, thick lanyard attached to a solid biometric identification card. I held it up so the chandelier light caught the embedded holographic state and federal seals. I tossed the badge onto the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy definitive smack right next to the forged will they had tried to use against me. "That is a Level 5 federal and state security clearance badge," I explained, watching Xavier's eyes lock onto the official government seal. "My title on public records might say Chief Political Strategist, but that is just the polite, digestible version for the media. What I actually do for a living is serve as the shadow architect of this state's entire political and physical infrastructure. I control the flow of state emergency funds. I manage the highest level crisis response teams. And absolutely no one, and I mean no one, touches a $50 million government technology contract without it crossing my private desk for a final uncompromising audit." Patricia let out a ragged, gasping breath. She brought a trembling hand to her throat, her expensive diamond necklace doing nothing to hide the frantic pulsing beat of her rapid heart rate. She was beginning to understand that they had not just picked a fight with a successful businesswoman, they had picked a fight with the very institution of power itself. "You reviewed my contract," Xavier stammered, taking a small, involuntary step backward. He shook his head desperately, trying to reject reality. "No, that is impossible. The state directors promised me total discretion. They assured me the approval was entirely locked down." "I did not just review your contract, Xavier," I said, taking a slow step toward him, forcing him to hold my gaze. "I audited it. I tore it apart line by line, pixel by pixel, and dollar by dollar. And what I found was honestly the most pathetic, amateurish attempt at corporate fraud I have ever seen in my professional career." Brittany squeezed her eyes shut, letting out a soft, whimpering sound as she pressed her back against the expensive wallpaper. She knew her husband was prone to cutting corners, but the sheer scale of what I was revealing was entirely beyond her comprehension. "You boast about building empires and generating generational wealth," I continued, my voice stripping away every last ounce of his manufactured dignity. "But you do not even have a real company. I tracked every single digital footprint you left behind. You used 6 different shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands to hide the fact that your supposedly revolutionary security software does not even exist. You repackaged an open-source free coding framework, slapped your flashy corporate logo on it, and attempted to sell it to the state government for $50 million. You were planning to leave the entire public security grid completely vulnerable just to line your own pockets." Xavier was visibly shaking now. The arrogant tech visionary persona he had cultivated for years was entirely stripped away, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, desperate con artist, caught red-handed. "You have no proof of that," Xavier whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "You are just trying to intimidate me." I smiled, a cold, ruthless expression that offered absolutely no mercy. "I have the IP addresses, the fake vendor profiles, and the offshore routing numbers, Xavier. But more importantly, I have the exact banking timestamps, showing when you wired bribe money to the 3 state procurement officials who approved your bid. You thought you were playing the game and outsmarting the system. You thought you had the state in your pocket. But the reality is, I let you believe you were winning. I personally instructed those officials to accept your bribes and approve your contract today, specifically so you would leave a massive, undeniable paper trail of federal fraud. I gave you the rope, and you eagerly tied the noose around your own neck." Patricia started breathing heavily, her chest heaving as a full-blown panic attack began to set in. She grabbed the edge of the mahogany table to keep herself from collapsing onto the floor. Her eyes darted wildly around the locked room, searching for an escape that did not exist. "Donovan?" She gasped, her voice shrill and completely unhinged. "Donovan, what is she talking about? What did he do? Tell me he did not just ruin us." Donovan ignored his wife. His face had morphed into a mask of pure murderous rage, but the anger was no longer directed at me. He turned his vicious glare entirely onto his son-in-law. He took a threatening step toward Xavier, his hands balled into tight, shaking fists. "What did you do?" Donovan demanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl that rattled the glasses on the table. "You told me this software contract was completely legitimate. You told me you had the state officials securely handled. If she is telling the truth, you just tied my entire remaining real estate portfolio to a federal bribery investigation. What exactly did you sign today, you incompetent fool?" Xavier backed away from Donovan, bumping hard against a leather armchair. He raised his hands in a defensive gesture, his eyes wide with sheer terror. "I handled it," Xavier pleaded, his voice cracking under the crushing pressure. "I swear to you, Donovan, the contract is signed. The state approved the advance. We just need the funds to clear tomorrow morning." I let out a soft, mocking sigh, shaking my head at his pathetic delusion. "Did you honestly believe I would let a $50 million state transfer clear your accounts?" I asked, watching the final shred of hope die in Xavier's eyes. Xavier stared at me, his mouth opening and closing in rapid succession, but absolutely no sound came out. The crushing weight of reality was finally breaking through his impenetrable wall of arrogance. He looked down at his massive diamond-encrusted watch, as if checking the time could somehow magically fast-forward his life past this horrific, suffocating moment. Donovan stepped dangerously close to his son-in-law, his fists trembling with violent intent. He looked ready to physically assault Xavier right there in the middle of the room, entirely abandoning the sophisticated, wealthy patriarch persona he had spent decades carefully cultivating. Before Donovan could unleash another wave of frantic screaming, the heavy brass handle of the VIP lounge door turned with a loud metallic clank. The thick, soundproofed oak door swung open with such tremendous force that it hit the interior wall with a resounding crack, sending a physical shockwave through the already suffocating atmosphere of the room. Governor Richard Montgomery stepped across the threshold. He did not look like a politician making a friendly social visit. His posture was rigid, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line, and his eyes radiated pure, concentrated fury. Flanking him on either side were 2 massive, heavily armed state troopers. The officers stepped into the room in perfect unison, immediately taking up tactical positions on either side of the heavy oak doors. They crossed their arms over their tactical vests, effectively sealing my family inside the room. There was no way out. Donovan, still trapped in his own desperate delusions of grandeur, immediately tried to pivot. He swallowed hard, forcing a sickeningly eager, desperate smile onto his sweating face. He smoothed down the front of his ruined tuxedo and took a tentative step toward the most powerful man in the state. "Governor Montgomery, thank God you are here!" Donovan stammered, his voice pitching up in a pathetic attempt at camaraderie. We were just dealing with a minor internal family dispute. My son-in-law here has been the victim of a terrible misunderstanding regarding his state security contract. I assure you my real estate firm is ready to personally guarantee the financial backing of his software company to ensure your urban renewal project proceeds without a single delay. Governor Montgomery did not even blink. He held up a single authoritative hand, silencing my father instantly. The gesture was so casually dismissive, so utterly devoid of respect, that Donovan physically recoiled. "Do not speak to me!" "Donovan," the governor ordered, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute obedience. "You do not have the standing, the leverage, or the moral authority to address me in this room." The governor slowly turned his imposing gaze away from my father and locked his eyes directly onto Xavier. Xavier immediately shrank back, his broad shoulders curling inward as he tried to make himself as small as possible. The confident, flashy tech entrepreneur who had spent the entire evening mocking my clothes and my career was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered fraud. I have spent the last 4 hours sitting in a secure, windowless briefing room with the state attorney general and the head of the Financial Crimes Division. Governor Montgomery began, his voice slicing through the heavy silence of the lounge. "We were actively monitoring a highly classified, coordinated sting operation. An operation meticulously designed and executed by my chief political strategist to root out corporate corruption attempting to infiltrate our state infrastructure." Patricia let out a soft, whimpering moan. She slowly slid down the expensive wallpaper, her legs completely giving out beneath her until she hit the floor. She sat there in her designer gown, her hands covering her face as the horrific magnitude of their mistake finally washed over her. "You actually thought you were sitting at the adults' table today?" Xavier, the governor, continued, taking a slow, predatory step closer to the trembling man. "You thought you could walk into the state capitol, hand a few manila envelopes filled with untraceable offshore cash to my procurement officers, and walk away with the keys to the entire public security grid. You truly believed you were the smartest man in the room." Xavier shook his head frantically, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. "Governor, please, there is a misunderstanding," Xavier begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "The software is real. I can deploy it tomorrow. I have the developers ready on standby. We just need the advance funds to clear." "Your $50 million contract was officially terminated 3 hours ago," the governor declared, delivering the fatal blow with absolute, unwavering disgust. "The procurement officers you thought you bribed were acting under direct classified orders from this woman. The bank accounts you wired your stolen money into were federal holding accounts designed specifically to trace your illegal shell companies. The state government never had any intention of doing business with a petty, incompetent thief." Brittany burst into loud, hysterical sobs. She covered her ears with her hands, shaking her head violently side to side, desperately trying to block out the catastrophic reality destroying her perfect, entitled life. "You did not just try to defraud the state, Xavier," the governor said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper as he gestured toward me. "You tried to defraud the woman who runs my administration. You tried to humiliate the most brilliant, ruthless, and indispensable political mind in this entire region. I trust Jocelyn with the safety, security, and financial stability of millions of citizens, and you thought you could outsmart her with a fake company logo and a forged wire transfer receipt." The room fell dead silent, save for the pathetic sounds of Brittany weeping and Patricia gasping for air on the floor. The state troopers remained completely motionless by the door, their hands resting near their duty belts, watching the spectacular collapse of my toxic family. Xavier looked at the troopers, then at the governor, and finally he looked at me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a wild, uncontrollable panic. The realization that he was facing decades in federal prison broke whatever fragile loyalty he held toward the family that had funded his lavish lifestyle. He started hyperventilating, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps that echoed loudly in the quiet room. He spun around, raising a shaking, accusatory finger and pointing it directly at the center of my father's chest. "It was Donovan's idea," Xavier screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice completely unhinged as he violently threw his father-in-law under the bus. "I did not want to do it. He forced me to do it. Xavier's desperate, high-pitched accusation hung in the heavy air of the VIP lounge for exactly 1 second before the fragile alliance of my toxic family completely violently shattered. Donovan's face turned a dangerous, mottled shade of purple. The sophisticated, untouchable patriarch mask he had worn for decades evaporated entirely, replaced by the sheer, unhinged panic of a cornered criminal. He crossed the short distance between them in two massive, aggressive strides. He lunged at his golden son-in-law, grabbing the lapels of Xavier's custom-tailored velvet jacket and twisting the expensive fabric tightly into his fists. "Shut your mouth, you incompetent fool!" Donovan roared, spit flying from his lips as he physically shook the taller man. "You are not going to pin your pathetic, sloppy mistakes on me. I had nothing to do with your amateur bribery scheme. You dragged this family into your mess, and I will personally see you rot in a federal cell before I let you drag my name through the mud." Xavier grabbed Donovan's wrist desperately, trying to pry the older man's hands off his ruined jacket. He shoved back his own panic, fueling a sudden, aggressive burst of adrenaline. "You handed me the contacts," Xavier yelled right back, his voice echoing off the soundproof walls. "You told me exactly which procurement officers needed a financial push. You set up the offshore accounts for the wire transfers." The two state troopers standing by the door immediately stepped forward, their hands dropping to their utility belts as the verbal argument threatened to escalate into an all-out physical brawl. But Governor Montgomery simply raised a single authoritative finger, silently ordering his security detail to stand down. He stood perfectly still, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the absolute carnage unfold with a look of grim satisfaction. He wanted them to destroy each other, and so did I. Brittany let out a shrill, piercing scream. She could not stand watching her father physically assault the husband who was supposed to be her guaranteed ticket to billionaire status. The illusion of her perfect high society marriage was collapsing, and she reacted with pure vicious hysteria. She lunged forward, grabbing Donovan's arm and digging her perfectly manicured nails deep into the fabric of his tuxedo sleeve. "Let him go right now!" Brittany shrieked violently, yanking her father away from Xavier. "You do not get to blame my husband for this. You do not get to play the innocent victim when you have been using him since the day we got married." Donovan stumbled backward, rubbing his arm where Brittany had scratched him. He glared at his favorite daughter with pure venom. "Using him," Donovan scoffed, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. "I funded his entire fake lifestyle. I paid for the cars, the clothes, the ridiculous engagement ring he gave you." Brittany let out a harsh, manic laugh, her perfectly styled hair now a messy, chaotic tangle around her flushed face. "You did not fund him out of the goodness of your heart," Brittany screamed, completely abandoning any remaining shred of family loyalty. "You hated that I was dating him at first. You complained constantly to your wealthy country club friends about my choices. But the absolute second you realized Xavier's tech startup qualified for state and federal minority-owned business grants, suddenly he was your favorite person in the entire world." The sheer ugly truth of Donovan's exploitation spilled out of Brittany's mouth like venom. "You paraded my husband around to every single diversity board and political fundraiser in this city," Brittany yelled, pointing an accusing finger at her father's chest. "You used his face, his race, and his charm as a literal human shield to secure those massive multi-million-dollar urban development grants for your own corrupt real estate projects. You told him exactly what papers to sign and exactly who to bribe so you could get your hands on that public funding to save your failing empire. You used him as your token puppet, and now you want to throw him to the wolves to save your own skin." Donovan stepped forward, his eyes bulging with rage. "He was a willing participant," Donovan shouted back, his voice raw and abrasive. "He took his cut of the grant money. He enjoyed the luxury cars and the VIP access just as much as you did. Do not pretend your precious husband is some innocent victim just because he was too stupid and too arrogant to cover his tracks properly." I stood a few feet away, entirely unbothered by the sheer physical and verbal violence erupting in front of me. I calmly picked up my crystal glass of ice water, feeling the cool condensation against my fingertips, and took a slow, refreshing sip. It was genuinely fascinating to watch the illusion of their perfect, loving family disintegrate into a vicious, bloodthirsty brawl. The moment their wealth and freedom were actively threatened, They instantly turned into feral animals, entirely willing to cannibalize their own flesh and blood just to survive another day. Actually, Brittany is absolutely right, I said. My voice cut through their screaming match with effortless, chilling precision. The fighting abruptly stopped. Donovan, Brittany, and Xavier all snapped their heads toward me, panting heavily, their eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and absolute terror. I reached back into my sleek leather bag. I bypassed the building deed and my security badge, pulling out a thick, heavily bound folder labeled with the official seal of the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I casually tossed it onto the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy thud right next to Xavier's fake charity check and the forged will they had tried to use to blackmail me. Donovan did use Xavier as a highly convenient prop to secure tens of millions of dollars in federal and state minority business grants, I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional as if I were delivering a corporate briefing rather than destroying their lives. But Xavier, did you ever actually bother to check where those grant funds went after they hit the joint accounts? Donovan graciously set up for you. Xavier froze. His bloodshot eyes darted from my face down to the thick federal folder resting on the table. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. You thought Donovan was rolling that grant money into your joint tech ventures? I continued, walking slowly around the edge of the table. You thought he was building your supposed generational wealth, but he was not. Donovan drained every single cent of that federal grant money the moment it cleared the state treasury. And the most pathetic part is that he did not even use those stolen funds to save his failing real estate empire. He funneled it all through a complex labyrinth of shell companies straight into the Cayman Islands. Donovan's face went completely ashen. He took a staggering step backward, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the back of a leather chair just to keep himself standing upright. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the cover of the federal folder. If you open this file, Xavier, you will find the exact offshore routing numbers, the digital signatures, and the time-stamped wire transfers. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Donovan wired $15 million of stolen federal grant money directly into Patricia's personal private accounts. The heavy, ominous silence in the soundproofed VIP lounge was shattered by the frantic rustling of paper. Patricia did not wait for Xavier to reach for the federal dossier resting on the mahogany table. Driven by a sudden blinding surge of self-preservation, my mother lunged forward, her expensive diamond bracelets clinking sharply against the polished wood as she snatched the thick folder with trembling hands. She ripped the cover open, her manicured fingernails nearly tearing the thick cardstock in her absolute desperation to see the contents. Her eyes, wide and bloodshot with terror, darted frantically across the top pages. She was staring directly at high-resolution copies of international bank statements, offshore wire transfers, and federal tracking documents bearing the unmistakable watermarks of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And there, highlighted in glaring yellow ink right at the top of every single account ledger, was her own name. Patricia was listed as the sole primary account holder for an offshore trust located deep in the Cayman Islands. The documents detailed a relentless, undeniable stream of deposits, hundreds of thousands of dollars dropping into her private account week after week, perfectly matching the exact timestamps of the state and federal minority business grants Donovan had funneled through Xavier's fraudulent software company. Patricia dropped the folder back onto the table as if the pages themselves had physically burned her fingers. She stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat, producing a harsh wheezing sound that echoed through the tense room. She looked down at her hands, trembling so violently she could barely keep them steady. The devastating reality of her situation hit her with the force of a freight train. She was not just looking at financial ruin or public humiliation anymore. She was looking at hard, irrefutable evidence of federal money laundering. She was looking at decades in a federal penitentiary. The lavish country club dinners, the designer gowns, the curated image of a wealthy matriarch. It was all vanishing in front of her eyes, replaced by the terrifying vision of orange jumpsuits and prison bars. In that exact moment, the deeply ingrained narcissism that had defined my mother's entire existence took absolute control. Without a single second of hesitation, without an ounce of loyalty to the man she had been married to for over 30 years, Patricia instantly turned on her husband. She spun around to face Donovan, pointing a shaking accusatory finger directly at his chest. "I did not know!" Patricia shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical ear-piercing pitch as she backed away from the man she had colluded with her entire life. She looked wildly toward Governor Montgomery and the armed state troopers standing by the door, desperately trying to paint herself as an innocent, helpless victim. "Donovan forced me to sign those papers," Patricia screamed at the top of her lungs, completely throwing her husband under the bus to save her own skin. "He is abusive. He handles all the finances in this family. He brought me a stack of tax documents last year and demanded I sign them on the bottom line. He told me it was just standard accounting paperwork for the real estate firm. I never asked questions because I was terrified of his temper. I had absolutely no idea he was funneling stolen grant money into my name." Donovan stared at his wife, his mouth hanging open in sheer, unadulterated shock. For a man who had spent his entire career manipulating and betraying everyone around him, seeing his own wife instantly offer him up as a sacrificial lamb to federal authorities was a blow he clearly had not anticipated. "You lying, treacherous snake!" Donovan hissed, the last remaining shred of his aristocratic composure completely evaporating. He took an aggressive, threatening step toward Patricia, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "Do not you dare stand there and play the innocent, battered housewife. You begged for that offshore account. You threw a massive tantrum because you did not want to pay domestic taxes on your ridiculous shopping sprees. You knew exactly where that money was coming from, and you spent it faster than I could even wire it across the border." He turned toward the governor, his face red and slick with cold sweat, desperately trying to drag his wife down into the mud right alongside him. "She is just as guilty as I am," Donovan yelled, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of his crumbling empire. "She demanded I find new revenue streams to fund her luxury lifestyle when my commercial properties started tanking. She is a greedy, bottomless pit." Patricia let out a loud, dramatic wail, pressing the back of her hand against her forehead, as if she were about to faint from the sheer distress of his accusations. She looked at me, her eyes wide and pleading, attempting the exact same emotional manipulation she had used to control me when I was a teenager. "Jocelyn, please, you have to believe me," Patricia begged, tears streaming down her carefully contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. "You know how your father is. You know how controlling he can be. I am your mother, Jocelyn. Please tell these officers I am innocent. You cannot let them take me to a federal prison for his crimes." I did not move. I did not flinch. I just stood there looking at the pathetic crying woman who had slapped me across the face less than 20 minutes ago for daring to wear a dress she thought was too cheap for her presence. I slowly set my crystal glass of ice water down on the edge of the mahogany table. The sharp clink of the glass against the wood cut through her hysterical sobbing. "Save the performance, Patricia," I commanded, my voice laced with absolute chilling authority. Patricia instantly stopped crying, her mouth falling open as she realized her theatrical tears had absolutely no effect on me. "You can try to sell that helpless victim narrative to a jury, but it is not going to work." I continued, taking a slow step toward her, forcing her to look me directly in the eyes. "Because I did not just find the offshore accounts. I tracked your spending. I tracked every single fraudulent dollar that exited the Cayman Islands and re-entered the domestic economy through your private luxury brokers." Patricia shrank back against the wall, her breath hitching as the inescapable truth closed in around her. "You did not just sign a few blind tax documents, Patricia," I stated, my voice echoing loudly in the silent, tense room, ensuring every single person present heard exactly what kind of monster she truly was. "You deliberately and actively spent $15 million of federal funding. You bought a fleet of custom imported luxury cars. You bought those 6-carat diamond earrings you are currently wearing right now. You booked private yacht charters to the Mediterranean. And you did it all with money stolen from low-income housing initiatives." Brittany gasped, taking a horrified step away from our mother. Xavier stared at Patricia with wide, disbelieving eyes, realizing the family he thought he was exploiting had actually been exploiting the most vulnerable citizens in the state on a massive, catastrophic scale. You took grant money specifically allocated by the state government to build affordable housing for struggling, destitute families, I said, stripping away the last remaining shred of Patricia's humanity. You took money meant to keep children off the streets during the winter, and you used it to buy yourself sparkling rocks and European vacations, just so you could impress your shallow, pathetic friends at the country club. You are not a victim, Patricia. You are a parasite, and your performance here today is exactly as cheap and fake as the life you built on stolen money. The name Patricia hung in the soundproofed air of the VIP lounge like a heavy, inescapable death sentence. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. The sheer magnitude of the crime transferring $15 million of stolen federal grant money into a personal account paralyzed every single person in the room. Then the horrific reality of federal prison finally shattered my mother's aristocratic facade. Patricia scrambled to her feet, her designer heels slipping clumsily on the polished marble floor. Her perfectly styled hair clung to her sweating forehead. She looked at the thick federal folder resting on the mahogany table, then at Governor Montgomery, and finally at the two armed state troopers blocking the only exit. The panic in her eyes was absolute and entirely self-serving. The wealthy socialite who had just slapped me across the face for wearing what she thought was a cheap dress was now staring down decades behind bars. And in that moment of ultimate desperation, the narcissistic matriarch of our family did exactly what I knew she would do. She instantly and viciously turned on her own husband. I did not know Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical, high-pitched wail that echoed painfully in the enclosed space. She pointed a violently trembling finger directly at Donovan. He forced me to sign those papers. I had absolutely no idea where that money was coming from. He is a monster. Donovan whipped his head around to face his wife, his jaw dropping in pure, unfiltered shock. The man who had spent decades enabling her lavish lifestyle and feeding her insatiable ego was completely blindsided by her immediate betrayal. Patricia did not stop. She launched into a frantic, desperate performance, throwing her hands in the air and backing away from Donovan as if he were holding a weapon. "He controls all the finances in this family," Patricia cried out, looking pleadingly at the governor and the state troopers, entirely abandoning her loyalty to save her own skin. "He is an abusive, controlling tyrant. He told me those were standard tax documents for the new commercial estate. He put a pen in my hand and stood over me until I signed them. I am a victim of his financial abuse. I am entirely innocent." Donovan's initial shock instantly boiled over into a volcanic, explosive rage. He took a massive, threatening step toward Patricia, his face contorting with a hatred so deep it made Brittany scream and jump behind Xavier. "You greedy, ungrateful parasite!" Donovan roared, his voice shaking the crystal glasses on the cocktail tables. "You are going to stand there and play the innocent victim. You begged for that money. You screamed at me every single night because your country club friends were buying summer homes in France and you felt left out. You demanded, I find a way to fund your pathetic, shallow social climbing. He forced me!" Patricia screamed back, tears of pure panic streaming down her face, completely ruining her expensive makeup. "Governor, please, you have to believe me. I am just a devoted mother and a dedicated housewife. I do not know the first thing about offshore routing numbers or federal grants. He manipulated me just like he manipulated Xavier. I watched them tear each other to shreds, feeling absolutely no sympathy for either of them. They were like two rabid animals trapped in a cage of their own making, violently cannibalizing their 30-year marriage, just to avoid a federal indictment. I let them scream at each other for another 30 seconds, letting the state officials in the room witness the true rotting core of my family. Then I reached forward and tapped my manicured fingernail against the heavy cover of the federal folder. The sharp, rhythmic tapping sound cut through their hysterical shouting match. "Save the performance, Patricia." I commanded, my voice slicing through the room with icy, calculated precision. "You are not a victim, and you certainly are not innocent." Patricia froze, her chest heaving as she turned her terrified gaze back to me. "Jocelyn, my sweet girl, please," Patricia begged, her voice dropping into a sickeningly fake, trembling whimper. "You know your father. You know how controlling he has always been. You have to tell them I did not know about the stolen funds. I picked up the folder, flipped it open to a specific highlighted page, and looked directly into my mother's lying eyes. "I know exactly what you knew, Patricia," I stated coldly. "Because I did not just track the incoming wire transfers. I tracked your outbound spending. I tracked every single dollar you drained from that illicit offshore account over the last 8 months." Patricia stopped breathing. The fake tears instantly dried up, replaced by the stark, terrifying realization that she could not manipulate her way out of this. "You claim you did not know where the $15 million came from." I continued reading straight from the federal audit. "Yet exactly 48 hours after the stolen grant money cleared your private Cayman Islands account, you wired $2 million to a private exclusive jeweler in Geneva. You purchased a custom $700,000 diamond necklace and matching earrings. The very same diamond necklace you are wearing around your throat right now." Patricia instinctively brought her shaking hand up to her neck, clutching the heavy diamond necklace, as if it were suddenly burning her skin. A week later, I continued, my voice relentless and entirely devoid of mercy. "You authorized a wire transfer of $4.5 million to purchase a luxury vacation villa in Monaco, entirely under your own maiden name. You bought 2 custom imported luxury SUVs, and you spent over $500,000 on a private interior designer to remodel your master suite. You did not just blindly sign tax documents, Patricia. You actively and enthusiastically laundered stolen federal funds to finance a billionaire lifestyle you never earned." Donovan let out a harsh, vindictive laugh, pointing at his wife. "Tell them the rest, Jocelyn," Donovan shouted desperately, trying to drag her down with him. "Tell them she knew exactly what that grant money was meant for." I closed the folder with a loud, definitive snap. "Oh, she knew exactly who she was stealing from," I said, staring at my mother with absolute, uncompromising disgust. "Those federal grants were explicitly earmarked for low-income housing initiatives and public school infrastructure overhauls in the most impoverished districts of this state." Patricia swallowed hard, shrinking back against the wall as the sheer moral depravity of her actions was laid bare in front of the governor. "You stole heating systems from struggling single mothers so you could host lavish garden parties," I told her, my voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal intensity. "You took educational resources away from thousands of vulnerable children so you could walk into a European jewelry store and pretend you were royalty. You literally bought blood diamonds with money meant to keep families from freezing on the streets." "But I am your mother," Patricia whispered, her voice completely devoid of its usual aristocratic arrogance. It was a pathetic last-ditch attempt to use our biological connection as a shield. "You lost the right to call yourself my mother the day you cut off my tuition and watched me starve, just so you could buy Xavier a Rolex," I replied, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or forgiveness. "You are not my mother. You are a federal criminal. And your desperate, pathetic attempt to throw your husband under the bus will not save you from a prison cell." Patricia lay crumpled on the imported rug, her hysterical sobbing reduced to pathetic rhythmic gasps. The terrifying finality of my words hung in the air, wrapping around the 4 of them like a suffocating shroud. I watched the absolute devastation wash over Brittany. For her entire 32 years of existence on this earth, my sister had been shielded from every consequence, every hardship, and every basic reality of adult life. She was the pristine golden child, the untouchable princess, who was conditioned to believe the universe existed solely to cater to her expensive whims. Now standing in the center of the VIP lounge, the grand illusion of her spectacular high society life was rapidly disintegrating right before her eyes. The luxury cars, the private country club memberships, the sprawling estates, they were all funded by the federal grant money her father had stolen, and the fraudulent tech contracts her husband had forged. She looked at her father, who was practically catatonic against the wall. She looked at her mother, who was weeping uncontrollably on the floor. And finally, she looked at the thick federal folders still resting lightly in my hands. Her manicured hands curled into tight, trembling claws. The sheer incomprehensible panic of impending poverty and public humiliation snapped whatever fragile thread of sanity she had left. Brittany let out a raw, ear-piercing shriek that sounded more like a wild animal than a poised socialite. She lunged forward, throwing her entire body weight across the polished mahogany table, her arms outstretched as she desperately tried to physically rip the federal evidence folders right out of my hands. I did not even flinch. I did not take a single step backward. Before Brittany's grasping fingers could come within 2 feet of my face, the two armed state troopers flanked me in perfect synchronized motion. One of the massive officers stepped seamlessly into her path, raising a solid, immovable forearm wrapped in dark tactical gear. Brittany crashed hard into his extended arm. The impact violently halted her momentum, sending her stumbling backward in her expensive designer heels. She hit the edge of a leather sofa and collapsed onto the cushions, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. "Do not touch me!" Brittany screamed at the stoic officer, her face twisting into a grotesque mask of pure, unadulterated entitlement. She pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my face, tears of sheer rage streaming down her perfectly contoured cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. "You ruined my life, Jocelyn. You deliberately set this up just to destroy my marriage and humiliate me in front of the entire city." Xavier stood frozen in the corner, entirely unwilling to step forward and defend his wife against the armed guards. Governor Montgomery watched the pathetic display with undisguised revulsion, his arms crossed over his chest. "You are completely insane if you think you can take my lifestyle away from me," Brittany yelled, her voice echoing painfully against the soundproofed walls as she scrambled back to her feet. "You are just jealous. You have always been insanely, pathetically jealous of me. I am the beautiful one in this family. I am the successful one. Mom and Dad chose to invest in me because I actually matter." She paced frantically behind the sofa, aggressively pointing at me with every venomous word, her narcissistic delusion blinding her to the fact that her husband and father were facing decades in federal prison. "Remember the night I got engaged to Xavier?" Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking with manic desperation. "You were sitting in the corner in some cheap blouse begging Dad to co-sign a lease for a miserable little apartment. And what did he do? He laughed right in your face. He told you to figure it out yourself, and then he turned around and handed Xavier a blank check for our honeymoon in Dubai. Remember when you had to sell your car just to make rent, and Mom told you to take the bus while she bought me a brand new Mercedes? We starved you out because you did not fit the brand. You were born to be a background character in my life, Jocelyn. You were designed to be the failure." Her breathing grew ragged, her chest heaving as she tried to reconstruct the shattered hierarchy of our family through sheer verbal violence. "You think walking in here with a fake security badge and a stolen building deed makes you special?" Brittany screamed, entirely rejecting the undeniable evidence presented by the governor himself. "You are nothing. You are an ugly, bitter spinster who had to buy a politician just to feel important for one single night. Xavier and I built an empire. We are the power couple of this state, and you are just a sad, lonely paper pusher trying to drag your betters down to your miserable level." I stood completely still, letting the echoes of her unhinged narcissistic meltdown fade into the heavy silence of the room. I looked down at my older sister, feeling absolutely no anger, no resentment, and certainly no jealousy. All I felt was a cold, clinical pity for a woman whose entire identity was built on a foundation of stolen money and spectacular lies. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the sofa where she stood, trembling with rage. "You really think your life is perfect, Brittany?" I asked, my voice dropping to a soft, razor-sharp whisper that commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the room. "You think you have the ultimate power? Marriage with your brilliant loyal tech CEO?" I smiled, a tight, merciless expression that made Xavier instantly drop his gaze to the floor. "Why don't we talk about where Xavier has been spending his weekends?" The rich, warm tone of Xavier's complexion completely vanished, leaving behind a sickly ashen gray that made him look like a ghost standing under the bright chandelier. He knew exactly what I was talking about. His broad shoulders slumped, and the arrogant chest-puffing tech mogul facade he had worn like armor all evening shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He took a frantic, stumbling step toward me, holding both of his hands up in a desperate, pathetic gesture of surrender. "Jocelyn, stop!" Xavier pleaded, his deep voice cracking into a humiliating, breathy whine. Please do not do this. We can make a deal. I will sign whatever you want. I will give you the shares. Just put the bag down. I am begging you. I did not stop. I did not even blink. I reached into my sleek leather bag and pulled out a slim silver tablet. I tapped the screen once to wake it up and synced it directly to the high-fidelity Bluetooth sound system built into the walls of the VIP lounge. Brittany whipped her head around to stare at her husband. Her manic, furious energy faltered, replaced by a sudden creeping paranoia. Xavier, what is she talking about? Brittany demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. Where have you been spending your weekends? You told me you were flying to Silicon Valley to secure venture capital for the new software update. I did not give Xavier a chance to formulate another one of his pathetic lies. I pressed a single button on my tablet. Instantly, the crisp, bubbly voice of a very young woman echoed through the surround sound speakers of the locked VIP room. Hey, Chavi baby, it is Lexi. The bright, heavily synthesized voice chirped through the speakers, dripping with absolute adoration. I just wanted to leave a quick voicemail to say thank you again for the brand new McLaren. They delivered it to my apartment this morning, and it drives like an absolute dream down Ocean Drive. You are the most generous man I have ever met. I cannot wait for our weekend in South Beach. I booked the penthouse suite at the Faena just like you asked. See you Friday, babe. I tapped the screen again, cutting off the audio and plunging the room into a heavy, suffocating silence. Brittany stopped breathing entirely. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers, her gaze locked onto the silver tablet in my hand, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. She looked at her husband, searching his terrified, sweating face for a denial, an excuse, a laugh, anything to prove that what she'd just heard was a fabricated joke. But Xavier could not even meet her eyes. He stared firmly at the imported rug, his jaw trembling. I looked at my older sister, feeling no sympathy for the woman who had spent 32 years making my life a living nightmare. That voicemail was left exactly 3 days ago, I explained, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Lexi is a 22-year-old bottle service waitress working at a high-end nightclub in Miami. But the most interesting part of this scenario is not the fact that your husband has been maintaining a secret second life in Florida for the past 14 months. The most interesting part is how he managed to fund it. Brittany let out a choked, ragged gasp, stepping toward me, with her hands clutching the fabric of her expensive designer dress. What did he do? She whispered, her voice shaking violently. I tapped the screen of my tablet, pulling up a secondary banking file, and read the brutal, undeniable truth aloud for the entire room to hear. A brand new McLaren sports car costs roughly $250,000, I stated with clinical precision. Xavier did not use the stolen federal grant money to buy that car. He knew the FBI would eventually flag a luxury vehicle purchase tied to a government technology contract. Instead, he logged into your joint banking portal and bypassed the security protocols. He drained the private inheritance account that grandfather left exclusively to you. He took your personal safety net, your generational wealth, and he used it to buy a $250,000 supercar for a 22-year-old waitress in South Beach. A sound like a gunshot rang through the VIP lounge. Brittany had crossed the room in a blur of motion and slapped Xavier across the face with such tremendous unhinged force that the heavy diamond ring on her finger left a deep bleeding scratch across his cheek. Xavier stumbled backward, crying out in pain and grabbing the side of his face. "You absolute parasite!" Brittany screamed at the top of her lungs, her vocal cords straining under the sheer magnitude of her fury. "You stole my inheritance. You took my grandfather's money and you spent it on some cheap trash in Miami while I was sitting at home defending your pathetic reputation to this entire city. I gave you everything. I elevated you." Xavier's terror instantly vanished, replaced by a vicious defensive rage. He dropped his hand from his bleeding cheek and stepped aggressively toward his wife, completely abandoning the loving, supportive husband act he had maintained for years. "You elevated me," Xavier roared right back, his deep voice shaking the crystal glasses on the tables. "I had to earn every single dollar of that inheritance just by putting up with your insufferable narcissistic personality every single day." Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to pretend to love a woman who is completely obsessed with herself? You are a shallow, vapid, empty shell of a human being. Brittany. Patricia let out a horrified shriek, rushing forward to try and separate them, but Donovan grabbed her arm and pulled her back, too paralyzed by his own impending legal doom to intervene. I only married you because Donovan promised me unlimited access to the family trust fund. Xavier yelled, the ugly, rotting truth of their marriage finally spilling out into the open. You were a business transaction. You were the entry fee I had to pay to get my hands on the capital. I needed to live the life I actually wanted. I have despised you since the day we met, and Lexi is 10 times the woman you will ever be. Brittany let out a feral, guttural scream of pure agony. She grabbed a heavy crystal champagne bucket from the nearest cocktail table and hurled it directly at Xavier's head. He ducked just in time, and the heavy crystal smashed against the soundproofed wall, sending a shower of sharp glass and melting ice raining down over the imported furniture. You are going to rot in federal prison! Brittany shrieked, tears of absolute devastation ruining her perfectly curated face. I will testify against you. I will hand the state prosecutors every single password to your fake tech companies. I will make sure you never see the light of day again. You lying, cheating thief. The perfect power. Couple of the state, the golden child, and her visionary tech CEO husband had been completely reduced to a vicious, ugly screaming match. They were tearing each other apart like wild animals, their entire manufactured existence dissolving into a pathetic display of greed and betrayal. I stood back and simply watched the illusion of the golden child turn into absolute rubble. The sharp, chaotic sound of shattered crystal continued to rain down over the imported leather furniture. Brittany stood in the center of the room, her chest heaving with violent, ragged breaths as she glared at the man she had proudly paraded around high society for years. Xavier was pressing a hand against his bleeding cheek, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and unhinged rage. The golden couple of the state, the supposedly brilliant tech entrepreneur, and his flawless socialite wife had been completely reduced to a pair of feral animals, tearing each other apart over stolen money and a bottle service waitress from Miami. Patricia remained crumpled on the floor, her hands covering her ears as she sobbed uncontrollably, entirely incapable of handling the absolute destruction of her carefully manufactured aristocratic reality. Donovan stood frozen against the back wall. His face was a sickly ashen gray, his eyes darting frantically between his screaming daughter, his bleeding son-in-law, and the thick federal folder resting on the mahogany table. The empire he had built on bribery, intimidation, and stolen government grants was actively burning to the ground, and he was completely powerless to stop it. I stood quietly near the edge of the room, holding my glass of ice water, watching the spectacular, well-deserved implosion of my toxic family. Before Brittany could grab another piece of crystal to hurl at Xavier, the heavy brass handle of the soundproofed VIP door clicked loudly. The thick oak doors swung open for the third time tonight. The two armed state troopers who had been guarding the exit immediately stepped aside, clearing the path with crisp, disciplined precision. Into the tense, suffocating atmosphere of the lounge walked a tall, sharply dressed man with silver hair and an expression of absolute, immovable authority. Following closely behind him were four imposing federal agents wearing tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI stamped boldly across their chests. The commanding presence of the federal authorities instantly sucked whatever oxygen was left right out of the room. Brittany froze, her manicured hands dropping to her sides as she stared at the federal agents. Xavier stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the wall, his bravado entirely crushed under the terrifying weight of impending federal prosecution. The silver-haired man stepped confidently into the center of the room, his piercing gaze sweeping over the shattered glass, the weeping women, and the two terrified men. He was Director Gallagher, the head of the Regional Federal Bureau of Investigation, and a man I had spent the last 6 months quietly coordinating with to bring this exact moment to fruition. Director Gallagher looked directly at Xavier, then shifted his hard, unforgiving gaze to my father. Donovan, seeing the federal agents fanning out across his exclusive rented lounge, instinctively tried to fall back on the only defense mechanism he had ever known: arrogance. He desperately tried to reconstruct his powerful, untouchable real estate tycoon persona. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, puffed out his chest, and took a highly aggressive step toward the director. "What is the meaning of this?" Donovan barked, trying to project a booming, authoritative voice, though the slight tremble in his vocal cords betrayed his mounting panic. "You are trespassing on a private closed-door event. I am hosting a multi-million-dollar charity gala in the ballroom outside, and I demand to know who authorized federal agents to barge into my exclusive VIP suite without a warrant." Director Gallagher did not flinch. He did not step back. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, tightly folded stack of official legal documents, bearing the unmistakable seal of a federal judge. "We have multiple warrants." Donovan Director Gallagher stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Warrants for your immediate arrest, warrants for the arrest of your son-in-law, and warrants to seize every single physical and digital asset connected to your fraudulent real estate holding companies." Donovan's face turned a violent, explosive shade of red. The sheer audacity of a law enforcement officer challenging his supreme authority in his own rented venue pushed him into a state of sheer delusion. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at the director's face. "You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with!" Donovan roared, spit flying from his lips as he aggressively closed the distance between them. "I am a pillar of this community. I am a major political donor in this state. I have powerful, untouchable friends in Washington who have dined at my personal estate. I make one phone call tonight, and I will have your badge stripped from you by tomorrow morning. I will see you working as a mall security guard for daring to disrespect my family." The four federal agents immediately tensed their hands, dropping to their duty belts, fully prepared to physically subdue the erratic billionaire. But Director Gallagher simply raised a hand, signaling his team to wait. He looked at Donovan, a cold, merciless smile slowly spreading across his weathered face. "Your friends in Washington are the ones who handed us your files," Donovan Director Gallagher said, delivering the fatal, crushing blow with absolute precision. Donovan froze. The furious, aggressive energy drained out of his body in a single, devastating second. His mouth hung open, his eyes wide with absolute, suffocating horror, as the true reality of his situation finally penetrated his arrogant mind. "The politicians you thought you bought off turned over every single offshore routing number and fake tax document you ever signed just to save their own careers." The director continued, stepping closer until he was standing just inches from my father's pale, sweating face. "You have been completely radioactive for months. Nobody is coming to save you. You are out of favors, Donovan. You are out of money, and as of right now, you are out of time." Director Gallagher turned his head slightly and nodded to the four federal agents standing ready behind him. "Take them," he ordered simply. The agents moved with terrifying, coordinated speed. Two of them converged on Xavier, grabbing him roughly by the arms and spinning him around to face the wall. Xavier let out a high-pitched, desperate sob, his knees buckling as the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs snapped aggressively shut around his wrists. He did not even try to fight back. He just wept loudly, begging anyone who would listen to give him a plea deal. The other two agents approached my father. Donovan instinctively tried to pull his arms away, his pride refusing to let him submit to the ultimate public humiliation. "Get your hands off me," Donovan shouted, struggling weakly against the firm, unbreakable grip of the federal officers. "I am a respected businessman. You cannot do this to me." The agents did not engage in conversation. They swiftly and forcefully pinned his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the VIP lounge sounded like the final definitive period at the end of his corrupt 30-year reign over our family. Patricia screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure terror, pressing her face against the imported rug as she watched her wealthy husband being treated like a common street criminal. Brittany stood completely paralyzed against the sofa, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes darting frantically between her arrested husband and her handcuffed father. The golden, untouchable empire they had used to torture and belittle me for my entire life was completely gone. replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of federal prison. The cold, heavy steel of the federal handcuffs had not even fully clicked closed around Donovan's wrists before his sheer, unadulterated narcissism violently rejected reality. For a man who had spent the last 3 decades operating under the absolute certainty that his vast wealth made him immune to consequences, the physical sensation of being restrained by law enforcement triggered a complete and total psychological short circuit. He thrashed his broad shoulders aggressively against the grip of the 2 federal agents, his custom Italian tuxedo jacket tearing slightly at the shoulder seam with a loud, sickening rip. "Get your hands off me, you rogue thugs!" Donovan bellowed, his face twisting into a grotesque mask of purple rage and absolute desperation. He dug the heels of his expensive leather shoes into the imported rug, refusing to be marched out of the VIP lounge like a common criminal. "I am the largest private employer in this city. I own half the commercial real estate on this entire block. You cannot simply barge into a private event and assault a prominent billionaire based on the fabricated lies of a jealous, deranged woman." Director Gallagher did not even blink at the pathetic outburst. He simply gestured for his agents to hold their ground, letting my father exhaust his remaining energy in a futile display of arrogance. But Donovan was not finished. His wild, bloodshot eyes darted frantically toward the open doorway of the VIP suite. Beyond the threshold, the grand ballroom was completely silent. Hundreds of the most influential politicians, socialites, and corporate executives in the state were standing frozen among the dining tables, craning their necks to witness the spectacular downfall of the city's most notorious real estate tycoon. Suddenly, a massive spark of desperate hope ignited across Donovan's sweating face. Standing just outside the heavy oak doors, flanked by a dozen uniformed city police officers who had arrived to secure the perimeter for the FBI, was the city chief of police. Chief Davis Donovan screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing piercingly through the silent ballroom and into the enclosed lounge. "Chief Davis, get in here right now." The chief of police, a highly decorated, no-nonsense veteran of law enforcement, slowly turned his head toward the VIP room. He stepped past the velvet ropes, his heavy boots echoing with a steady, intimidating rhythm against the marble floor. Donovan immediately launched into a frantic, breathless tirade, fully believing that the local corruption he had nurtured for years was finally going to save him from federal prison. "Chief, I demand you arrest these rogue federal agents immediately," Donovan commanded, spitting the words out as he struggled against the FBI agents holding his arms. "They are trespassing on my rented property. They are actively harassing a major political donor and attempting to unlawfully detain my family without a shred of verified evidence. My daughter Jocelyn has orchestrated an elaborate illegal smear campaign to steal my assets." Donovan puffed out his chest, his delusion blinding him to the stark reality of the room. "I single-handedly funded the massive renovation of your police union hall last year. Chief, I donated $2 million to the city pension fund. I bought the absolute loyalty of your department. I order you to unhook these cuffs, arrest this delusional woman, and physically remove these federal imposters from my sight before I call the mayor and have your entire command staff terminated." Xavier, still sobbing quietly against the wall with his own hands cuffed securely behind his back, looked up with a sudden pathetic glimmer of hope. Brittany stopped weeping for a brief second, holding her breath as she waited for the chief of police to rescue their golden empire from absolute destruction. Chief Davis walked slowly into the center of the VIP lounge. He stepped over the shattered crystal from the champagne bucket Brittany had thrown earlier. He looked at the weeping, trembling Xavier. He looked at Donovan, who was practically foaming at the mouth with desperate entitlement. Then Chief Davis turned and looked directly at me. He did not look at me with the contempt my family expected. He did not ask for my identification or demand I step back. Instead, the chief of police gave me a sharp, profound nod of absolute respect, silently acknowledging the grueling, highly classified work we had done together over the past several months. I smiled back, taking a slow sip of my ice water, thoroughly enjoying the spectacular theater of my father's impending doom. Donovan's frantic, triumphant smile instantly vanished. His eyes darted between me and the chief of police, a deep, sickening confusion washing over his sweating face. Chief Donovan stammered, his voice suddenly losing all of its booming thunder. "What are you doing? Why are you nodding at her? Arrest her." Chief Davis unclipped the heavy, solid steel handcuffs from his own duty belt. He stepped directly up to my father, invading his personal space with an immovable, terrifying authority. "I have been working on a joint anti-corruption task force with Jocelyn for 6 months. Donovan, the chief of police, stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that offered absolutely zero mercy. The color drained entirely from Donovan's face. His mouth fell open, but his vocal cords completely paralyzed. The realization that he had not just been outsmarted by his daughter, but had been actively investigated by the very local authorities he thought he owned, shattered his mind into a million irreparable pieces. "You do not own my department, Donovan," the chief continued, his tone laced with absolute disgust. "The $2 million you thought you donated to the police pension fund was immediately flagged, seized, and transferred to a federal evidence holding account on the exact same day you wired it. We used your own attempted bribery funds to finance the undercover sting operation that finally took down your corrupt real estate empire." The chief of police reached out, taking the chain of the federal handcuffs already securing Donovan's wrists. He slapped his own heavy steel cuffs right over them, locking them tight with a sharp, echoing click that signaled the definitive, undeniable end of Donovan's freedom. "You are done," the chief declared coldly. "You are completely out of moves, out of money, and you are going away for a very long time." Donovan's knees buckled. The massive, untouchable patriarch of our family went completely limp, his entire body sagging against the strong grip of the federal agents. He did not scream. He did not fight back. He simply stared blankly at the imported rug, his spirit entirely broken by the sheer crushing weight of his catastrophic defeat. Patricia watched her husband collapse in defeat. She watched the chief of police step back to allow the FBI agents to begin marching Donovan toward the door. She looked out into the hallway, seeing the horrified, judgmental faces of the high society friends she had spent decades desperately trying to impress. The realization hit her like a speeding freight train. The money was gone. The political connections were gone. The fake aristocratic status she valued more than her own children was completely eradicated. She had no leverage left. She had no husband to hide behind, and she had absolutely no one coming to save her from the devastating consequences of laundering stolen federal grant money. Patricia slowly turned her head and looked at me. The arrogant, vicious matriarch who had spent my entire life calling me a failure, who had slapped me across the face just an hour ago, completely dissolved into a pathetic, desperate shell of a human being. Her legs gave out. She dropped hard to her knees right in front of me, the heavy fabric of her expensive designer gown pooling around her on the floor. Patricia lunged forward, her manicured hands desperately clutching the fine silk fabric of my custom $15,000 gown. Her heavy diamond-encrusted earrings swung wildly against her neck as she completely abandoned any remaining shred of her aristocratic dignity. The massive open oak doors of the VIP lounge meant that hundreds of the most elite politicians, corporate executives, and socialites in the state were standing in dead silence in the main ballroom, watching the mighty matriarch of the real estate empire begging on her hands and knees. "Jocelyn, my baby!" Patricia wailed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical shriek that echoed painfully off the marble floors. "Please, I gave birth to you. I am your mother. You cannot let them take us." She yanked on the hem of my dress, her knuckles turning white from the force of her desperate grip. Tears of pure, unadulterated terror streamed down her face, dragging thick streaks of expensive mascara across her cheeks. The flawless, confident woman who had slapped me across the face just an hour ago was entirely gone. In her place was a terrified, cornered criminal who finally understood that her wealth could no longer shield her from the consequences of her own actions. "You have to tell the governor to stop this," Patricia pleaded, her chest heaving with violent, ragged sobs. "Tell the FBI agents to let your father go. We are your family, Jocelyn. You cannot send your own flesh and blood to a federal prison. I raised you, I gave you life. Please, I will do anything you want. I will give you whatever you ask for. Just tell them, this is a massive misunderstanding. I looked down at the pathetic weeping woman groveling at my feet. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no residual daughterly affection, no lingering trauma, and absolutely zero guilt. I did not immediately try to pull away from her frantic grip. I simply stood there like a statue carved from solid ice, letting the entire room, the governor, the FBI director, and the silent ballroom audience watch her completely debase herself. I let her experience the exact suffocating humiliation she had intentionally subjected me to for my entire life. You gave birth to me, Patricia, I stated flatly, my voice so quiet and lethal that it forced everyone in the VIP lounge to hold their breath just to listen. But you were never my mother. I slowly leaned down, bringing my face closer to her weeping, terrified eyes. The heavy scent of her expensive floral perfume mixed sickeningly with the sharp, acrid smell of her nervous sweat. She stared up at me, her lips trembling as she waited for a lifeline, a shred of mercy, or a sign that my familial loyalty would override my pursuit of justice. She found absolutely none. Do you remember the night I turned 18? I asked, keeping my gaze locked directly onto hers. Patricia froze, her sobbing catching in her throat. She blinked rapidly, her panicked mind desperately trying to search through decades of her own cruelty to identify which specific instance of abuse I was referencing. I was standing on the front porch of your massive estate in the freezing, pouring rain. I reminded her, ensuring my pronunciation was razor sharp. Donovan had just thrown all my belongings onto the wet driveway in garbage bags because I flatly refused to sign away my academic grants to help fund Brittany's luxury European vacation. I was terrified. I had absolutely $0 to my name. I was shivering, holding a trash bag full of wet clothes. I begged you right there on the porch to let me stay inside for just one more night so I would not freeze on the street. Patricia swallowed hard, her grip on my dress loosening slightly as the horrific memory finally surfaced in her self-centered mind. "Jocelyn, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own rapid breathing. I was protecting the family dynamics. You were being difficult. I ignored her pathetic attempt to rewrite history. I kept my eyes entirely devoid of emotion, staring right through her. Do you remember exactly what you said to me as you locked the heavy oak front door, right in my face? I asked, my tone demanding absolute accountability. Patricia shook her head, tears spilling over her eyelashes. "No, please," she sobbed, realizing that her past actions had securely locked the door on her own future. You looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. I recounted, repeating the exact words that had fueled my relentless drive for the past 16 years. And you said if you cannot survive on the streets, that is your own fault. I only associate with winners. The words hung heavily in the tense atmosphere of the VIP lounge. The sheer calculating cruelty of her past statement echoed in the minds of the federal agents and the state troopers standing guard. Even Brittany, who had spent her entire life benefiting from Patricia's toxic favoritism, covered her mouth with her trembling hands, realizing the absolute finality of my verdict. With a single deliberate and forceful motion, I stepped backward. I physically ripped the delicate silk fabric of my couture gown straight out of Patricia's desperate, clutching hands. Without my dress to hold on to for physical balance, Patricia pitched forward. Her arms flailed uselessly as she fell flat onto the floor, her face hitting the imported rug with a dull, heavy thud. She lay there sprawled across the ground, a ruined, defeated shell of the elite socialite she had pretended to be. "You made your bed, Patricia," I declared, looking down at her crumpled form with absolute unyielding finality. "Now rot in it." A loud, piercing wail erupted from Patricia's throat as she clawed at the carpet, her complete psychological breakdown on full display. The loss of her status, the loss of her wealth, and the terrifying guarantee of federal prison completely shattered her mind. She realized she was utterly powerless. The stark contrast between her arrogant, violent entry into this room and her current pathetic state on the floor was the ultimate satisfying demonstration of justice taking its natural course. I slowly turned my back on her weeping form, refusing to give her another second of my attention. Director Gallagher gave me a short, respectful nod, silently confirming that the boundary I had just drawn was absolute. The federal agents tightened their grip on Donovan and Xavier, preparing to execute the next phase of our coordinated operation. My toxic family had dug their own graves, and I had simply handed them the shovels. Director Gallagher gave a sharp, authoritative nod to the 4 federal agents securing my father and my brother-in-law. The sheer physical presence of the law enforcement officers completely dominated the enclosed space of the VIP lounge. "Move them out," the director commanded, his voice, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. One of the agents placed a firm hand on the back of Donovan's ruined tuxedo jacket, preparing to pivot him toward the secondary door at the back of the suite. That specific door led directly to a discreet private service elevator connecting to the underground loading dock. It was the standard protocol for high-profile white-collar arrests, a quiet, unobserved exit designed specifically to avoid public spectacles and media attention. I took a deliberate step forward, raising my hand to halt the federal agent. "Director Gallagher," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and exceptionally polite. "As the sole legal owner of this entire commercial property, I must insist that my guests do not use the service corridors. It violates our internal security protocols. The grand front entrance is much more accommodating for a departure of this magnitude." Director Gallagher looked at me, a flicker of genuine understanding crossing his weathered face. He knew exactly what I was doing. He glanced at the sweating, trembling men in handcuffs, then back to me and offered a subtle, grim smile. "Of course, Jocelyn," the director agreed smoothly. "We always respect the requests of the property owner. Bring them out through the main ballroom doors." Donovan's head snapped up. The color that had previously drained from his face was instantly replaced by a stark, terrifying shade of ghost white. For a man who had spent 3 decades meticulously crafting a flawless, intimidating public persona, the sudden realization of what I was about to do to him hit harder than a physical blow. He was going to be paraded in handcuffs directly through the very center of his own 60th birthday gala. He was going to be publicly crucified in front of every single billionaire politician and rival corporate executive he had spent his entire life trying to dominate. "No!" Donovan gasped, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate wheeze. He instinctively tried to dig the heels of his expensive leather shoes into the carpet, pulling back against the unyielding grip of the federal agents. "Please, no. Do not do this. Take the service elevator. Take me through the kitchen. I will go quietly. I will not fight. Just use the kitchen exit, I am begging you." I walked slowly across the room until I was standing mere inches away from the man who had verbally and emotionally abused me for my entire adult life. I looked at his shaking hands tightly secured by heavy steel chains. I looked at the sheer, unadulterated terror swimming in his wide, bloodshot eyes. I leaned forward, dropping my voice into a soft, razor-sharp whisper right next to his ear. "Do not worry, Dad," I said, making sure he felt the absolute chill of my words. "You do not have to leave through the kitchen today. You get the front door." I turned my back on him and signaled my personal security team standing by the primary entrance. "Fling the doors wide open." The heavy soundproofed oak double doors of the VIP lounge were simultaneously thrown open, revealing the massive sweeping marble staircase that descended directly into the heart of the grand ballroom. The upbeat, elegant jazz music that had been playing just an hour ago was completely dead. The enormous, cavernous hall was submerged in a heavy, suffocating silence. Hundreds of the most powerful and influential people in the state were standing shoulder to shoulder on the ground floor, all staring up at the VIP balcony with breathless anticipation. Governor Montgomery stepped out onto the landing first, an immovable symbol of absolute state authority. I stepped out right beside him, looking down at the sea of wealthy donors and socialites. Then the federal agents marched Donovan and Xavier out into the blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers. A collective echoing gasp ripped through the crowd of hundreds. It was a sound of pure, unfiltered shock. The mighty, untouchable real estate tycoon, the man who had hosted this lavish diamond jubilee to celebrate his own manufactured greatness, was standing at the top of the stairs in heavy steel handcuffs. His custom-tailored tuxedo was ripped at the shoulder. His face was slick with terrified sweat. Right beside him was his golden son-in-law. Xavier, the supposedly brilliant African-American tech visionary who had bragged about securing $50 million state contracts, was openly weeping. Xavier's velvet jacket was ruined. A deep red scratch from Brittany's diamond ring was bleeding visibly down his cheek, and his broad shoulders shook with violent, uncontrollable sobs. "Walk," the lead federal agent ordered, giving Donovan a firm push forward. The descent down the grand marble staircase was agonizingly slow. Every single step Donovan and Xavier took echoed loudly in the dead silent ballroom. It was the ultimate, inescapable walk of shame. The crowd parted automatically, stepping back as if my father and brother-in-law were carrying a highly contagious disease. As they reached the ground floor and began the long, humiliating march toward the main entrance, the paralyzing shock of the crowd finally broke. The silence was instantly replaced by a tidal wave of harsh, vicious whispers. I watched from the top of the balcony as rival real estate developers openly sneered at my father. Wealthy socialites covered their mouths, their eyes wide with judgmental glee, as they witnessed the total annihilation of the family's social standing. The very people Donovan had spent thousands of dollars to impress were now pulling out their smartphones. The bright, relentless flashes of phone cameras illuminated the dark, cavernous hall, documenting every single second of their spectacular downfall. Xavier stumbled over his own expensive leather shoes, completely blinded by his frantic tears. A federal agent roughly caught him by the bicep, hauling him back to his feet and shoving him forward. The arrogant tech mogul, who had mocked my clearance rack suits, was now crying like a helpless child, fully aware that his mistress in Miami, his stolen sports cars, and his fraudulent empire were entirely gone. Donovan kept his head down, staring fixedly at the marble floor. His chest heaved with rapid, panicked breaths. He could hear the mocking whispers. He could see the camera flashes out of the corner of his eye. The absolute humiliation was breaking him down on a cellular level. He had built his entire identity on being the most powerful predator in the room, and now he was nothing more than a pathetic handcuffed criminal being escorted off my private property. Back in the VIP lounge, Patricia and Brittany remained completely paralyzed. They dragged themselves to the edge of the glass balcony, looking down at the ballroom floor in sheer, unadulterated devastation. Brittany clutched the glass railing, her knuckles turning stark white as she watched her husband being perp walk through the crowd of her elite peers. Patricia covered her face with her trembling hands, realizing that she would never, ever be able to show her face in this city again. The high society life they had fiercely protected by tearing me down was officially permanently over. As the federal agents pushed Donovan and Xavier through the massive glass front doors of the estate, the flashing blue and red lights of a dozen waiting police cruisers illuminated the night sky. The local press, having been anonymously tipped off by my office an hour prior, swarmed the entrance. The bright, blinding lights of television news cameras hit my father's face, securing his absolute ruin on the evening broadcast. The heavy steel doors of the federal transport vans slammed shut, echoing into the cool night air, leaving my mother and sister trapped in the ruins of their own making. Exactly 8 hours after the heavy steel doors of the federal transport vans slammed shut, taking my father and my brother-in-law into federal custody, the crisp, biting morning air of the city settled over the sprawling, excessively gaudy residential estate that Donovan had built with stolen public funds. It was precisely 8:00 in the morning. The massive wrought iron security gates that shielded the property from the main road were locked tight, a pathetic final barrier, meant to keep the consequences of their actions at bay. I stood at the base of the long, sweeping brick driveway, my breath forming faint white clouds in the cool morning light. Flanking me on my right was my lead corporate attorney, Mr. Pierce, holding a thick leather briefcase packed with irrefutable legal judgments. Flanking me on my left were 3 uniformed county sheriffs, their hands resting comfortably on their utility belts, completely unfazed by the intimidating scale of the mansion looming at the top of the hill. We did not bother buzzing the intercom to ask for permission to enter. Mr. Pierce simply handed a finalized judicial override order to the lead sheriff, who stepped forward and used a heavy pair of bolt cutters to snap the thick steel chain securing the pedestrian access gate. The heavy chain hit the concrete with a loud metallic clatter that echoed through the quiet, affluent neighborhood. We walked up the sweeping driveway in a unified, unstoppable formation. The crunch of our shoes against the decorative gravel sounded like a marching drumbeat, signaling the absolute end of their aristocratic delusion. The house was a ridiculous monument to Donovan's unchecked ego, featuring massive Greek columns, a three-tier marble fountain, and an imported mahogany front door that cost more than my entire college education. The lead sheriff did not bother looking for a doorbell. He raised his heavy-gloved fist and pounded on the custom mahogany wood with tremendous deafening force. "Open up, County Sheriff!" the officer bellowed, his voice carrying the uncompromising weight of the law. "We have a court order for immediate eviction and asset seizure." For a long moment there was no response. The massive house remained entirely silent, as if the occupants were holding their breath, desperately praying the nightmare outside would simply give up and walk away. The sheriff raised his fist to strike the door a second time, but the heavy brass lock suddenly clicked. The door was yanked open by Patricia. The sight of my mother was genuinely jarring. The flawlessly polished, untouchable socialite who had demanded my removal from the gala just hours ago was entirely gone. She was wearing a wrinkled silk bathrobe, hastily tied at the waist. Her expensive salon-styled hair was a chaotic, tangled mess, and dark, heavy smears of ruined mascara stained her cheeks from a sleepless night of hysterical crying. "What is the meaning of this?" Patricia shrieked, her voice raspy and frantic as she tried to physically block the wide doorway with her body. "You have absolutely no right to be here. My husband is a prominent political donor. I demand you leave my property this instant before I call the mayor and have every single one of your badges permanently revoked." I stepped out from behind the imposing frame of the lead sheriff, moving directly into Patricia's line of sight. "You cannot call the mayor, Patricia." I stated, my voice as calm and chilling as the morning air. The mayor spent his entire morning holding an emergency press conference to publicly distance his administration from the radioactive fallout of Donovan's arrest. "No one is taking your phone calls today." Patricia gasped, stumbling backward into the grand foyer, as if I had physically pushed her. She stared at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, completely unable to comprehend how I was standing on her pristine front porch alongside armed law enforcement. Brittany suddenly appeared at the top of the grand, sweeping staircase inside the foyer. She looked even worse than our mother. She was clutching a designer throw pillow to her chest, her face pale and swollen from crying over the loss of her fraudulent husband and her stolen inheritance. "Mom, what is going on?" Brittany demanded, her voice shaking violently as she hurried down the marble steps. "Why are there police officers inside our house?" Mr. Pierce stepped forward, opening his leather briefcase with a sharp, professional snap. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bearing the bright red stamp of the County Supreme Court and thrust them directly into Patricia's trembling hands. "These are immediate, non-negotiable foreclosure and eviction notices," Mr. Pierce explained, his tone completely devoid of sympathy. "Your husband Donovan secretly leveraged this entire residential estate as collateral to secure a massive commercial loan 3 years ago. When his primary development firm defaulted on that debt last quarter, the bank prepared to seize this property." Patricia stared blankly at the dense legal jargon covering the pages, her mind completely failing to process the financial ruin printed in black and white. "This is impossible," Patricia stammered, shaking her head in frantic denial. "Donovan would never risk our primary residence. We own this house outright. It is our family home." "It was your family home," I corrected her, stepping over the threshold and fully entering the magnificent foyer that I had been banished from for years. "When the bank moved to foreclose, they quietly auctioned off the defaulted mortgage to a private holding company. My holding company. I bought the debt for pennies on the dollar. The final grace period to clear the outstanding balance expired at exactly midnight last night." Brittany dropped her designer pillow onto the floor. She charged forward, her face twisting into a mask of pure, desperate entitlement. She aggressively swiped the legal documents out of Patricia's hands and tried to rip them in half, but the thick bonded paper refused to tear. "You cannot do this to us!" Brittany screamed, throwing the crumpled documents onto the marble floor. "You cannot kick us out into the street. We are your blood. This is my childhood home. I will call Xavier's lawyers right now. I will have you sued for illegal harassment." "Xavier's lawyers abandoned you the absolute second the federal government froze his bank accounts this morning," I replied, easily shutting down her pathetic threat. "And as for treating blood with respect, do you remember the winter I turned 19? I asked, my voice rising just enough to command absolute silence in the grand foyer. Brittany froze, her frantic breathing hitching in her throat as I forced her to confront the reality of her own historical cruelty. "Do you remember when you threw that lavish, catered holiday pool party right here in this exact house using the trust fund money you stole from me?" I continued, taking a slow, intimidating step toward my older sister. "I drove here in a beat-up freezing car to beg Mom for a tiny loan to cover my heating bill because my apartment radiator was broken. You stood right there on those marble stairs holding a glass of imported champagne and you laughed. You told the security guards to lock the gates because my cheap clothes were ruining the aesthetic of your party. I slept in my freezing car that night while you drank champagne bought with my stolen inheritance." Patricia covered her mouth with her hands, letting out a soft, pathetic sob as she realized that every single act of cruelty they had inflicted upon me had been meticulously catalogued and was now being returned with devastating interest. "You loved telling me that this house was for the actual elite," I reminded them, my gaze sweeping over the opulent chandeliers and the expensive modern art hanging on the walls. "You loved reminding me that I was a worthless outsider who did not belong within these walls." "Well, congratulations, Brittany. The outsider just bought the entire building and you are currently standing on my imported marble floor." I looked at the lead sheriff, who immediately stepped forward, resting his hand on his utility belt to signal that the time for negotiation was officially over. I turned my attention back to the two weeping broken women who had tormented me for my entire existence. I delivered my final verdict with absolute uncompromising authority. "You have 30 minutes to pack exactly 2 suitcases each. Everything else inside this house belongs to my holding company." From the grand foyer, I could hear the chaotic, pathetic symphony of their panic echoing through the massive estate. Doors were violently slammed open. Hangers clattered loudly against hardwood floors as entire designer wardrobes were aggressively torn apart. I could hear Brittany shrieking in pure agony, realizing that she could not possibly fit 300 pairs of imported luxury shoes into a standard piece of luggage. Every frantic footstep, every muffled sob, and every crash of a thrown object was the sound of 30 years of stolen wealth and unearned arrogance being forcefully stripped away. I did not move from my spot near the front entrance. I simply stood beside my corporate attorney, looking up at the magnificent crystal chandelier hanging above us. I had spent my entire youth being treated like a disposable peasant in this very house, and now I was the one dictating exactly how much of their fake empire they were allowed to carry out the front door. Exactly 29 minutes later, the heavy footsteps of the deputies signaled their return. Patricia and Brittany appeared at the top of the stairs. The image they presented was the absolute antithesis of the high society royalty they had projected just 24 hours ago. They were both sweating profusely, their faces flushed and completely devoid of makeup. They awkwardly dragged 2 heavily overstuffed, strained suitcases each. The zippers on the bags looked ready to burst under the pressure of the tightly packed silk dresses and cashmere coats they had frantically chosen to save. They slowly navigated the steep marble steps, the heavy plastic wheels of their luggage thumping loudly against the pristine stone. Neither of them looked at me. Their eyes were fixed firmly on the ground, entirely consumed by the crushing, inescapable humiliation of their eviction. As they reached the bottom of the staircase and began dragging their bags across the grand foyer toward the open front door, I noticed a very specific erratic tension in Brittany's posture. She was clutching a thick, velvet, structured carry-on tote bag tightly against her chest, holding it with a frantic, desperate protectiveness that completely betrayed her guilt. She was walking slightly sideways, trying to shield the tote bag from my line of sight. "Hold on a moment," I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the foyer. Brittany froze instantly. Her shoulders hiked up to her ears, and she instinctively gripped the velvet tote bag even tighter. Patricia stopped walking, looking back at her golden child with wide, terrified eyes. "I told you to pack personal clothing, Brittany," I stated, taking a slow, measured step toward her. "I did not authorize the removal of corporate assets." "Open the tote bag." Brittany's face contorted into a vicious, defensive snarl. "You said 2 suitcases and a personal bag," she shouted, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "These are my personal belongings. You cannot search my things without a warrant. I know my rights." I glanced at the lead sheriff standing beside the door. He immediately stepped forward, placing a heavy, authoritative hand directly onto the handle of Brittany's tote bag. "Actually, ma'am," the sheriff said in a low, immovable tone, "under a comprehensive asset seizure order, every single item leaving this foreclosed property is subject to a full visual inspection by the new legal owner. You can open the bag yourself, or I can confiscate it entirely as evidence of attempted theft. The choice is yours." Brittany looked at the armed officer, then at me. Her lower lip trembled violently as the final realization set in that she possessed absolutely zero power in this situation. With shaking, reluctant hands, she slowly unzipped the top of the velvet tote. I stepped closer and looked inside. Buried underneath a layer of expensive silk scarves was a heavy, ornate mahogany jewelry box. "Take it out," I ordered. Brittany let out a loud, pathetic sob. She reached into the bag and pulled the box out, her hands shaking so badly that the brass hinges rattled. She opened the lid. Resting on a bed of black velvet was an absolutely massive, breathtakingly expensive diamond and sapphire necklace. It was a custom vintage piece that sparkled brilliantly, even in the natural morning light spilling through the open front doors. That was an anniversary gift from Xavier. Brittany shrieked, clutching the box toward her chest. "It is mine. You cannot take my personal jewelry." I looked at the stunning array of diamonds, recognizing the specific cut and setting immediately from the forensic financial audit my investigators had conducted. "Xavier bought that custom sapphire necklace for you exactly 4 months ago," I said, keeping my tone entirely clinical and devoid of mercy. "He purchased it directly from a private dealer in Geneva, and he paid for it by routing $300,000 straight out of the Restricted Family Trust Fund. The same trust fund you and Donovan illegally drained after completely erasing me from grandmother's will." Brittany gasped, stepping backward as if she had been physically burned by my words. "That necklace is not a gift, Brittany." I continued, reaching out and firmly pulling the mahogany box right out of her trembling hands. "That necklace is stolen property purchased with embezzled federal and trust assets. It belongs to the federal evidence holding account, and by extension, it belongs to me to satisfy the outstanding corporate debt you all accrued." I snapped the jewelry box shut with a loud, definitive click. "Now take your cheap suitcases and get off my property before I have the sheriff arrest you for attempting to smuggle stolen assets across state lines." Brittany let out a feral, agonizing wail. She turned and practically ran out the massive front doors, dragging her heavy, overstuffed suitcases down the front steps, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the concrete. Patricia followed silently right behind her, her head bowed in absolute total defeat. She did not say a single word. The wealthy, narcissistic matriarch had been entirely broken. I walked out onto this grand front porch, standing between the towering Greek columns, and watched them struggle down the long, sweeping brick driveway. They dragged their luggage over the decorative gravel, the cheap plastic wheels struggling and protesting under the immense weight of their ruined lives. When they finally reached the heavy iron security gates at the bottom of the hill, they stopped and looked around the empty street. Their luxury SUVs and imported sports cars had all been seized by federal agents the night prior. Their bank accounts were completely frozen. They had absolutely no transportation. A few minutes later, a beat-up, rusted compact rental car pulled up to the curb. It was a cheap economy rideshare vehicle that Patricia must have ordered using the last few dollars of a prepaid debit card. The driver popped the trunk, revealing a tiny cramped space that could barely hold a single piece of luggage. I stood on the porch and watched the spectacular, deeply satisfying reality check unfold. Patricia and Brittany were forced to aggressively shove and kick their overstuffed bags into the tiny trunk, ruining their expensive silk clothes in the process. Brittany had to ride in the back seat with a suitcase practically resting on her lap. The driver honked his horn impatiently, completely unaware that he was transporting the former royalty of the city's real estate empire. The rusted compact car sputtered loudly, the exhaust coughing out a cloud of dark smoke as it pulled away from the curb. I watched the taillights disappear down the winding suburban road. They had no money, no powerful connections, and no family left to manipulate or destroy. They were driving away from their former kingdom, in an absolute suffocating silence, completely cast out into a world they had spent decades looking down upon. The empire was dead, and I had securely locked the gates behind them. The greatest lesson I learned is that true power never needs to announce itself. My family used loud arrogance to mask their deep insecurities. They tried to make me feel small because they were terrified of my potential. I realized you cannot heal in the exact environment that broke you. Walking away from blood relatives who drain your spirit is never a failure. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. Success built in quiet determination is the best response to their noise. Have you ever cut ties with a toxic relative to find peace? Share your story in the comments below.